You can imagine yourself standing in a field during the early medieval centuries. Long before a stone tower rises above the landscape, you feel the uneven earth beneath your feet, smell damp soil, and hear only distant animals moving through grass. This open ground may seem empty to you, but to the people of that era it held possibilities. A lord, a leader, or sometimes a frightened community saw promise in a simple stretch of land. A castle, in its earliest idea, often began not with ambition for grandeur, but with fear, vulnerability, or the hope of protection. Long before great walls circled hillsides, the earliest builders walked the terrain with bare observation as their primary tool. They studied the rise and fall of the land. They noted where water pooled after rain. They watched how shadows moved during the day, revealing how much sunlight the place received. These choices were not dramatic, yet they carried weight that determined generations of survival. You may not think much about a slope facing the morning sun, but medieval builders did. They understood that frost lingered longer on shaded ground, that dampness weakened timber over time, and that enemy soldiers preferred to strike from concealed angles. These quiet observations shaped the earliest sketches of what would become a fortress. Even before stone was considered, wooden earthworks marked the first stage of medieval defense. A simple palisade fence, a raised mound, or a dug ditch could serve as the beginning of a fortification. It is easy to think of castles only as towers and keeps, but their true foundation was knowledge passed between generations. Carpenters understood how much weight timber could bear. Farmers knew where soil eroded in heavy rain. Shepherds recognized which paths invaders might use. In this way, ordinary people participated in the earliest steps of castle building, even if their names were never written down. Imagine the early builders marking out a circular area with simple stakes. These stakes represented where the first wooden walls would rise. Workers dug earth with handheld tools, often nothing more than wooden spades reinforced with bits of iron. The work was repetitive and slow. Soil had to be carried away in woven baskets. Men and women labored side by side, though historical records rarely mention the women who hauled earth or prepared materials. You can sense the monotony of it. Step, dig, lift, carry, yet this labor created the raised mounds still visible in parts of Europe today. Once the mound was shaped, wooden beams were set deep into the earth to form a palisade. These timbers were sharpened at the top, forming a barrier that could deter raiders. The structure had little beauty and no ornament, but it offered something far more important. Time for a village to prepare, time for guards to respond, time for lives to be protected. Even the smallest defensive barrier altered how communities lived and thought. As the centuries progressed, stone replaced wood. The transition was slow and uneven. Stone required skilled masons, tools that could cut and shape rock, and access to quarries. Transporting stone alone was a monumental task. Oxen struggled along uneven paths, pulling heavy loads day after day. The work demanded patience, coordination, and a collective belief that the effort mattered. You may feel sleepy just imagining the rhythm of those long journeys, the wheels turning steadily while workers walked beside them. Selecting stone was a deliberate process. Builders chose limestone, sandstone, or granite, depending on availability and purpose. Limestone was easier to shape, sandstone resisted weathering, and granite offered exceptional strength, though it demanded the most effort. The decision was never simple. You can imagine masons tapping stones with small hammers, listening for the subtle differences in sound that revealed density or hidden fractures. A dull thud could indicate weakness. A clear ringing tone suggested reliability. These tiny decisions influenced the stability of walls that would stand for centuries. Before the first stone was placed, a master mason drew plans, often on wooden boards coated with chalk. The designs were not architectural drawings in the modern sense. They were simplified outlines, proportions, and measurements that existed as much in the mason's memory as on his board. The master mason served not only as designer, but also as manager, teacher, and problem solver. Skilled masons learned through years of apprenticeship, advancing slowly through tasks. Many spent entire lives on a single castle, contributing quietly to a structure that would endure long after their deaths. When construction began, the earliest stones of a castle were laid with meticulous care. Foundations had to be deep enough to resist shifting soil. Trenches were dug, often by laborers who were not craftsmen but hired workers, peasants, or villagers fulfilling service obligations. Into these trenches went the first stones, set in layers with mortar made from lime and sand. The mortar had to cure slowly, Rushing the process could weaken the entire foundation. You can picture the workers waiting as the mixture hardened, checking the consistency with practiced calm. Modern listeners might find this waiting tedious, but in the medieval world patience was a necessity. Gradually, walls rose. The earliest castles typically formed simple rectangles or irregular shapes that followed the natural contours of the land. Walls were thick, sometimes several yards across, with inner layers of rubble to save material. Using rubble might seem like a shortcut, but it was a deliberate technique that made walls easier to build and surprisingly resilient. The outer layers bore the weight, while the inner filler added mass and stability. As the walls grew taller, scaffolding was erected. Wooden platforms supported workers as they carried stones upward. Ropes and pulleys lifted heavy blocks. The creaking of timber, the scrape of stone, and the murmur of voices filled the air day after day. You can imagine the rhythm becoming almost meditative. The work was not glamorous, yet each action contributed to a structure that symbolized authority, security, and permanence. Inside the rising walls, builders shaped the ground into courtyards, storage pits, and walkways. They planned where animals would be kept, where fires would burn, and where people would gather. Even the location of a kitchen mattered. If placed too close to living quarters, smoke could seep into rooms. If placed too far, meals arrived cold. Such small decisions influenced daily life far more than battles or grand ceremonies. The keep, often considered the heart of a castle, was usually built last. It served as both residence and refuge. Its thick walls protected those inside even if outer defenses fell. Building a keep required extraordinary precision. Corners had to be perfectly aligned, or the structure risked collapsing under its own weight. Workers checked angles with plumb lines and squared tools crafted by metal workers. These instruments were simple compared to modern tools, yet the accuracy achieved was remarkable. While stone and mortar shaped the visible structure, the unseen forces of human cooperation held everything together. Entire communities contributed labor, resources, and expertise. Quarry workers extracted stone. Carpenters produced scaffolding. Blacksmiths forged tools. Women prepared food for the workforce, carried water, and participated in construction tasks often left unrecorded. Children fetched supplies. Monks documented agreements, payments, and property rights. Every person had a role. It is easy to imagine the final structure as inevitable, but each castle emerged from countless small decisions, each made by individuals responding to the challenges of their time. Weather, supply shortages, illness, and war frequently interrupted progress. A single storm could wash away days of work. A bad harvest could halt construction for an entire season. These realities slowed even the most ambitious projects. When at last a castle stood complete, it was not a monument to a single moment but to years of effort. The stones held stories of labor, fear, hope, and daily routine. Yet, standing in that moment of completion, one quiet question often lingered in the minds of those who built it. How long would this new stronghold truly keep them safe? And what challenges would future generations face that the builders could not yet imagine? When you step forward in time from those first stones resting in the earth, you enter a different stage of castle building. The foundations no longer represent mere hope. They have hardened, settled, and accepted the weight placed upon them. What rises next is not only physical height, but the shaping of an entire way of life. Once a castle's lower walls stood solid, communities found themselves adjusting to a new presence on the landscape, one that changed how they worked, how they moved, and how they understood authority. You can imagine yourself standing beside a half-built curtain wall. The stones above you form a rising line, their surfaces rough and unpolished. Workers climb ladders built from freshly cut timber, their hands coated with dust. Each man or woman moving across the scaffolding repeats motions developed through generations. Lift, position, check alignment, spread mortar, tap the stone into place. This rhythm creates the slow heartbeat of the construction site. The sound is steady but not loud. Nothing about the process feels hurried. Everything depends on consistency. By the time the walls of a medieval castle reached a person's height, the builders had already solved countless small problems. Mortar batches needed the correct balance of lime and sand. Too much lime made the mixture brittle. Too little prevented binding. Some communities burned limestone in small kilns built on site. The fire needed constant feeding, and the transformation of stone into quicklime required watchfulness. Once cooled and crushed, the powder was mixed with water in large pits. The workers stirred the muddy mixture with long wooden paddles. The chemical reaction produced heat and fumes, and those standing too close felt their eyes sting. Yet without this substance the entire structure would crumble. Raising the walls also meant planning the castle's inner structure. You can picture the master mason walking through the incomplete site, tracing future spaces with his hands as he spoke to assistants. Here would be the hall, where meals were eaten and decisions made. There would stand the storerooms, dry and cool. Over there, a small chamber for records. None of these areas were intended to be grand. Their purpose was function, not display. The people who built castles focused not on magnificence but on stability. They cared that grain stayed dry, that smoke could escape through vents, and that doors remained firm in winter winds. With walls reaching higher, the nature of work changed. Ground laborers had carried the first stones. Now, experienced masons shaped the blocks that would be seen for generations. Their tools were simple: chisels, mallets, wedges. Progress came from repetition, not innovation. Each day, a mason listened for the right crack as stone separated cleanly. He checked the straightness of edges with cords stretched tight. The sun warmed his back, and fine dust clung to his hair. A single block might take half a day to shape. When placed into the wall, it joined thousands of others. The work was not memorable in the moment, yet the results formed the skeleton of the medieval world. As the walls rose taller, the builders introduced narrow openings. These slits, often called arrow loops or arrow openings in later centuries, allowed defenders to observe and shoot without exposing themselves. From outside, these openings looked like little more than thin lines carved into stone. From inside, however, they widened into triangular or rectangular spaces where archers could stand. Designing these openings required careful understanding of angles. Too narrow, and the archers lacked room. Too wide, and the wall weakened. Such matters occupied hours of discussion, even if no written record preserved the conversations. At the same time, the builders shaped doorways and passages. Door arches required precision. A misaligned arch could collapse under pressure. To prevent this, carpenters constructed wooden frames to guide the stones. Masons placed wedge-shaped blocks along the curve, forming what would become a stable arch once the keystone was set. When the arch finally stood on its own, workers removed the wooden frame and moved it to the next doorway. The frame might serve dozens of arches over the years. Nothing was wasted. Inside the rising castle, carpenters cut beams for floors and roofs. Although stone formed the outer strength, wood provided the structure of daily life. Upper rooms depended on thick timbers set firmly into the walls. Carpenters carved notches, measured angles, and worked with iron nails produced by blacksmiths. The sound of their tools mixed with the masons' tapping, creating a layered rhythm. You can imagine how these combined noises formed a soundtrack for a growing settlement. The sounds drifted across fields, signaling progress to everyone nearby. But building a castle required more than construction skill. It demanded predictable supplies. And that meant organization. Record keepers tracked expenses, labor obligations, food quantities, and payments to craftsmen. They wrote on parchment with ink made from oak galls. Their handwriting formed careful lines documenting details. Most people ignored the number of carts arriving each week, the amount of iron purchased for nails, or the wages of a traveling mason whose expertise was needed for a particularly difficult angle. These records reveal the slow and often dull backbone of castle building. Without such mundane management, the stones could not continue to rise. As walls closed into shapes that suggested completed rooms, the internal layout became clearer. You can picture the hall roof beginning to take form. Carpenters placed one beam after another, testing strength by applying pressure with their bodies. A stable roof allowed workers to focus on interior details. Floors were covered first with packed earth, then with wooden planks when available. Fireplaces were positioned within thick walls. Each chimney needed a safe path upward, avoiding structural weaknesses. Mistakes meant smoke drifting into living spaces or walls damaged by heat. These problems could take years to correct. The builders also had to consider water. A castle needed access to fresh water at all times, especially during emergencies. Some sites had springs within their boundaries. Others required wells dug deep into the earth. Well digging was dangerous and slow. Workers lowered themselves into the shaft with ropes, chiseling through soil and stone. Buckets of debris were hauled up by teams above. The air inside the shaft often grew stale, and collapses occurred without warning. Yet the work had to continue. Without water, a castle could not sustain life. Once a well reached water, the builders reinforced the shaft with stone rings. These rings had to be perfectly aligned. If one shifted, the entire structure risked collapse. Masons carved each ring to fit precisely, lowering them carefully into place. The process required steady hands and calm concentration. Few people who later used the well ever considered the effort buried beneath their feet. By the time the walls reached their full height, the castle imposed itself upon the surrounding land. Farmers working in nearby fields saw its silhouette each day. Travelers noticed it from a distance. Its presence signaled both safety and control. A castle secured trade routes, but also enforced obligations. Peasants paid dues or labor to support its upkeep. Visitors submitted to inspection. The stronghold stood as a constant reminder of the power relationships shaping medieval society. Yet, inside the walls, life remained practical rather than majestic. Rooms filled slowly. Furniture arrived piece by piece. Most furnishings were simple: wooden benches, rough tables, straw mattresses. Decorative items were rare and expensive. For the majority of people living or working in a castle, comfort mattered less than function. They cared about warm rooms during winter, dry storage for grain, and safe shelter when danger approached. As the structure neared completion, attention turned to the outer perimeter. Builders constructed the gatehouse, often the most complex part of a castle other than the keep. The gatehouse housed mechanisms for lifting a heavy entry barrier. It contained rooms for guards, storage for weapons, and systems for delaying intruders. Early versions of these structures were not elaborate, but they required precise measurements. If the entryway was too wide, the gate lacked strength. If it was too narrow, carts could not pass. Balancing these needs took careful planning and long experience. Beyond the gatehouse, ditches or embankments shaped the approach. Workers used picks and spades to carve trenches into the earth. The removed soil was piled into ridges that made assault more difficult. Often, these earthworks took longer to build than the stone walls themselves. Rain softened the ground, requiring constant reinforcement. The labor looked repetitive and unimportant, yet it created obstacles that defined medieval warfare. With each stage completed, the castle moved closer to serving its intended purpose. But although these structures were born from fear of danger, most of the daily work inside them revolved around routines far removed from conflict. People cleaned rooms, fed animals, prepared food, washed clothing, and tended fires. These tasks shaped daily life more than any battle. The castle's design reflected those needs. Storage areas were kept cool and dry. Hearths were placed strategically. Pathways allowed servants to move efficiently. Still, builders understood that peace could not be guaranteed. They added walkways atop the walls. Guard posts offered visibility across the landscape. Towers provided higher vantage points and safer positions during threats. Each of these features required careful construction. The height of a tower mattered. If too tall, the walls strained under its weight. If too short, the view was limited. The builders balanced these concerns with practical knowledge developed from earlier structures. When the castle finally approached completion, the question shifted from how to build it to how it would function in the long years ahead. Would the walls withstand harsh winters? Would the roof survive storms? Would water remain dependable? You can imagine the builders looking at their work with a mixture of pride and worry. They knew that problems unseen during construction could emerge later. They also understood that future generations would depend on the choices they made now. That lingering uncertainty leads to a quiet question. As the first inhabitants prepared to live within the finished walls, what hidden weaknesses or overlooked decisions might shape the future of the fortress in ways the builders never expected? When the last stones settled into their beds and the final scaffolding came down, the castle did not feel finished in the way a modern building might. Instead, it felt like a living framework waiting for generations to fill its spaces, test its limits, and slowly reshape it through ordinary use. You can imagine standing before it at this moment of completion. The walls are new and stark, their surfaces brighter than they will ever be again. The air carries the scent of fresh lime mortar, and clumps of earth still lie scattered around trenches where workers cleared their tools. It is in this transitional moment, when the building stands ready but not yet broken in by life, that the castle reveals the fullness of its purpose. It was built to endure, to shelter, and to provide order in a world that often lacked it. As the first inhabitants moved in, they brought with them daily routines that would soon define the castle more deeply than its stones. The earliest occupants rarely included only the noble family. Servants, guards, cooks, stable workers, clerks and stewards all passed through the new gate for the first time. You can imagine the cautious steps of people entering rooms they would someday know intimately. They examined the strength of doors, the width of stairways, and the reliability of the water supply. They listened for echoes in the hall, and smelled the newly cleared hearths. The castle was sturdy, but untested. Every new footstep echoed with possibility. The noble household, often the reason the castle was commissioned in the first place, carried different concerns. They had to decide how to organize spaces for governance, hospitality, and protection. A great hall had to be arranged not simply for meals, but also for receiving visitors, hearing petitions, and storing vital documents. The lord or lady might walk slowly through the hall, taking in the proportions of the room, imagining meals in winter or gatherings in late summer when travel was easier. Their decisions shaped the castle's social rhythms, even if those decisions sometimes arose from simple practicality rather than grand intention. Yet, no matter who moved inside, the castle itself shaped behavior. Narrow staircases forced people to walk single file. Thick stone walls kept rooms cool in summer and bitterly cold in winter. Small windows offered protection, but allowed limited light. Fireplaces needed constant tending. These elements created a daily environment of restrictions and adjustments. People learned to carry extra cloth for warmth. They timed their chores around daylight. They stored perishable foods near cooler sections of the castle. The building imposed patterns that quietly governed life. One of the first challenges residents faced was managing smoke. Fire kept people alive during cold seasons, but smoke gathering in hallways and chambers created discomfort. Builders had placed vents and chimneys with care, but these systems rarely worked perfectly. Soot accumulated inside flues. Drafts shifted with the wind. Servants spent long hours clearing ash and adjusting airflow by opening or closing shutters. These tasks may seem dull to you, yet they formed part of the constant maintenance that allowed castles to function. The interior also required adaptation for safety. Stone floors grew slippery in damp weather. Wooden floors above needed reinforcement to support heavy furniture. Carpets were rare, and straw scattered across stone floors needed to be replaced often to prevent insects. Cooks prepared food in the castle kitchen, a space intentionally separated from important rooms to reduce fire risk. The careful placement of these work areas reflected hard-won experience. Generations of builders knew that a kitchen fire could erase years of labor. For this reason, kitchen hearths were built with wide flues and sturdy foundations. Large pots hung above slow-burning fires, watched constantly by kitchen workers who learned to interpret subtle changes in heat and smoke. As life settled into the castle, the outer defenses became more than architectural features. The walls, towers, and gatehouse changed how people perceived their own security. Guards walked the ramparts at dawn, scanning fields for movement. They learned the sounds of local wildlife, so they could distinguish between the rustle of animals and the approach of strangers. The height of the towers allowed them to see far, but the visibility also reinforced a sense of obligation. Guards knew that failing to notice approaching danger could threaten the entire community. Outside the walls, villagers observed the castle's growing influence. Markets formed near its gates. Farmers adjusted their routes for transporting supplies. The presence of the stronghold shaped the economy as much as it shaped the landscape. The castle demanded grain, livestock, firewood, and building materials. Meeting these needs created opportunities for trade. Village life expanded around these demands, bringing quiet change to the region. Despite the stability the castle offered, it also created tensions. Obligations to support the stronghold could strain rural households during lean years. Herds needed to be tended, fields harvested, and tools repaired, all while supplying goods to the lord's household. Some villagers benefited from new work, while others felt the weight of increased duties. These social pressures, though rarely recorded, shaped daily life more deeply than battles or political events. Inside the castle, administrative work formed another layer of its functioning. Clerks maintained records of rents, repairs, and disputes. They wrote slowly and carefully, aware that parchment was costly. Their work preserved agreements between the castle's residents and the people who lived under its protection. The castle became a center of paperwork, not simply warfare. Small decisions documented in these records influenced land ownership, resource distribution, and financial obligations for generations. As years passed, the castle began to show signs of use. Stone steps smoothed under constant traffic. Iron fittings rusted in damp corners. Wooden beams dried, shrank, and creaked in changing temperatures. Workers repaired cracks in mortar, replaced broken tiles, and reinforced weakened areas. These repairs, although unremarkable individually, extended the life of the structure. Without such steady attention, even the strongest walls would eventually fail. Weather played a powerful role in this cycle. Storms tested the roof, cold winters stressed timber, wet seasons encouraged moss and mold along the walls. The environment shaped the castle as surely as human hands did. Builders had known this when they chose materials and dimensions, but no amount of planning could prevent nature from influencing the structure over time. People living inside learned to accept these changes as part of daily reality. Yet perhaps the most subtle transformation came, not from weather or daily life, but from the changing nature of warfare. New tools, tactics, and strategies gradually challenged the original design. As methods of assault evolved, castles needed modifications. Some added outer walls, others built new towers or reinforced gates. These additions reflected the ongoing relationship between defense and innovation. Builders returned to the site years or decades after the initial construction, adjusting their earlier work with fresh understanding. In many ways, the castle became a layered story. Each generation left its mark. Some installed better drainage. Others improved the keep's interior. Still others expanded the outer defenses. None of these changes replaced the original design. Instead, they blended with it, creating a structure that held the decisions of countless individuals. The castle grew to reflect, not a moment in time, but an accumulation of choices shaped by need and circumstance. You can imagine walking through such a structure centuries after its completion. In the Great Hall, you might see beams added long after the first roof was built. In the courtyard, you might step on stones polished by thousands of footsteps. The well at the center might still draw water from the same underground source first discovered during the earliest days of construction. Each feature, though ordinary in appearance, would carry traces of its long history. The castle's decline also formed part of its story. Over time, as political systems changed and newer forms of defense emerged, many castles lost their original purpose. Some became administrative centers, others served as storage sites, prisons, or residences. A few fell into disuse entirely, their walls slowly surrendering to plant growth and shifting earth. Yet even in ruin, the earlier work remained visible. The careful placement of stones, the alignment of towers, and the design of the gatehouse continued to reveal the mind of the medieval builder. What is most remarkable is that the builders rarely imagined their work lasting far beyond their own lifetimes. Their focus remained on immediate needs. They considered the safety of their communities, the command of their lords, and the resources at hand. Yet the structures they created endured far longer than they expected, outliving many of the people who shaped them. The stones carried memories that individuals could not record. Through resilience and adaptation, these castles became touchstones of history, revealing quiet truths about labor, survival, and the practical wisdom of ordinary people. Looking back across those centuries, one question remains. If the builders could see how their creations survived, changed, and sometimes crumbled, what would they think of the world that inherited their work, and how many of their small decisions still influence us in ways they never imagined? The first frost of winter always arrived quietly across the northern plains, settling over the low hills like a pale shroud. Villagers woke to find the earth stiff beneath their boots, the streams edged with thin mirrors of ice, and the world wrapped in a breathless stillness. In an age before surveyed borders and marked pathways, winter did not simply cool the land, it redrew it. Rivers became roads, marshes became firm ground, and places unreachable in summer became open, if one dared to trust the ice. Among the people who knew this frozen world best were the wanderers whom villagers called the silent pilgrims. They were neither monks nor merchants, neither beggars nor bandits, yet they carried themselves with a solemn purpose that made it difficult to place them among common folk. These travelers moved along the winter roads as soon as the land hardened, walking in long cloaks lined with rough fur, their faces often hidden by broad hoods that protected them from the wind. They always traveled in pairs or groups of 3, never more, and never spoke to strangers except when necessary. For some, their arrival was a sign of safety. A family living at the edge of the forest might watch the pilgrims pass and feel reassured, for these wanderers were known to warn villagers of wolves that had come too close, or of snowstorms gathering far to the north. For others, however, the sight of them stirred unease. Households whispered tales that the pilgrims carried secrets in their quiet steps, and that they walked for reasons that no one had ever quite understood. Some said they were descendants of an old order that had once kept peace across the northern kingdoms. Others believed they were guardians of forgotten shrines buried beneath the ice. A few even insisted that the pilgrims followed something ancient, something older than the church bells and older than the carved idols of the villages. What set them apart most of all was their refusal to accept shelter unless invited directly. They never knocked on doors, never requested warmth, never asked for food, and yet, despite their silence, despite their distant air, villagers often found themselves offering shelter anyway. Something about the travelers carried a gravity that made the host feel honor-bound to care for them, though no one could quite explain why. The winter of this story began with a heavy snowfall that blanketed the northern plains earlier than usual. Before the fields had even been fully harvested, the frost swept in like a host of ghosts dragging long white cloaks. Grain stores filled in haste, meat was salted quickly, and tools were brought indoors as the land froze days ahead of expectation. The villagers of Brackenfold, a small and isolated settlement pressed between two forests, braced themselves for a long, difficult season. It was on a morning when the cold felt sharp enough to bite exposed skin that the first pilgrim of the year appeared. She was tall, though the villagers saw little of her beneath her hood. Her steps were measured, quiet on the packed snow. As she neared the village square, the small collection of cottages and the wooden hall seemed to watch her as much as the people did. Children who had been chasing each other across the snow slowed, wide-eyed, as the figure passed. Dogs barked once, then fell silent. A woman named Elda, who kept a house at the south edge of the village, stepped forward cautiously. She carried a basket of firewood, and stopped when the pilgrim turned her head slightly toward her. No words were spoken, yet Elda felt compelled to offer something, perhaps out of the instinctive respect these wanderers inspired. "You may warm yourself by my hearth," she said softly. The pilgrim inclined her head in acknowledgement and followed Elda to the cottage. Inside, the warmth from the fire softened the air. The traveler removed her gloves, revealing hands marked with faint lines of old scars, the kind not made by combat but by long journeys, through cold and unforgiving places. She offered no name, as was customary, and Elda did not ask. While the pilgrim sat near the fire, Elda's husband Ulrich watched her with curiosity. He was a carpenter, broad-shouldered and steady-handed, and though he had seen pilgrims before, something about this one unsettled him. She scanned the room with slow, deliberate attention, as though she were memorizing its shape. Every so often she tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something beyond the crackling of the fire. At midday she rose and offered a quiet nod to her hosts before stepping back into the cold. Elda watched her go, feeling as though she had just welcomed a spirit rather than a traveler. The villagers spoke among themselves that evening about the arrival, though their words carried more wonder than worry. It was said that the first pilgrim of winter was a sign that the season would be manageable, for these wanderers often sensed danger along the winter roads before it arrived. But when the second pilgrim appeared only a few days later, some of that comfort turned to concern. He was older, wrapped in a heavy grey cloak that dragged slightly along the snow. His eyes were sharp, despite the weathering of his face, and his breath misted steadily as he paused at the entrance of Brackenfold. He asked for nothing, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was deeper than the quiet woman's, and carried a weight that caused all conversation in the square to fall silent. "The ice is shifting," he said, "faster than it should." Then he continued walking without another word. The villagers tried to make sense of his warning. The ice along the rivers had always been dangerous, but it formed slowly, predictably. If it was shifting early or behaving differently, that could mean something unusual in the north. Some blamed strange winds. Others suspected distant quakes beneath frozen mountains. A few whispered theories of old spirits that some claimed still moved beneath frozen lakes. None of these explanations felt solid, but in the depths of winter, imagination often grew wild. Days later, a third pilgrim arrived. A young man this time, though he walked with the weary posture of someone older. His clothing was torn along one sleeve, as if he had brushed against something jagged. Unlike the others, he did not remain silent upon entering the village. Instead, he approached the gathering hall and leaned heavily against its doorframe. His breaths came short, as though each inhale caused him pain. When the villagers came to help him, he lifted a hand to stop them. "Keep your children close," he murmured. "Do not let them wander the river path." A silence fell so deep that even the wind seemed to hold back. "What threat comes?" asked Ulrich, stepping forward with slow caution. The pilgrim closed his eyes, gathering what little strength he had left to answer. "There are shapes under the ice," he whispered. "Shadows that move against the current. They follow us. They follow the winter road." Then he collapsed. The villagers carried him inside and tended to his wounds. Though he recovered enough to open his eyes by nightfall, he spoke no more. Whatever fear had driven him here lay coiled inside his silence, refusing to take form in words. Rumors spread swiftly. The villagers remembered old tales from their grandparents, stories told beside low fires during deep winter nights, legends of things that lurked beneath frozen rivers, creatures shaped by forgotten winters, so cold that even the sun abandoned the sky. Most dismissed such stories as inventions of sleepless nights, but now, with the pilgrim's warning echoing in their minds, such tales felt less distant. The days grew colder still. The wind sharpened into a blade that cut across the plains. The ice thickened, but now villagers hesitated to walk across it, even during simple tasks like fetching water or gathering firewood. Children were kept inside, dogs paced restlessly, hackles raised when brought near the riverbank. Yet the pilgrims remained at the edge of the village, watching the northern horizon as though expecting something to appear. Their presence that had once reassured, now unsettled. They did not eat with the villagers, nor warm themselves by the communal fire. Instead, they gathered in hushed conversation near the frozen river, their voices low and strained. One night, when the moon was a thin pale slice in the sky, Alric stepped outside and noticed something strange. The river, usually silent beneath its heavy ice, emitted a faint sound. Not the usual creaking or settling of a frozen surface, but something like distant tapping, slow, rhythmic, almost purposeful. The sound continued for several breaths, then faded. When he told the other villagers the next day, some refused to believe him. Others, already fearful, avoided the river altogether. The children, restless from being kept indoors, began to sense the tension that had settled like frost over every conversation. The pilgrims gave no explanation, though their watchfulness grew sharper. On the 5th day after the tapping began, the older pilgrim addressed the villagers again. His voice had lost some of its strength, but his message was firm. "Two of us will leave before dawn," he said. "One will remain. If the ice breaks, you must not approach it, no matter what you hear." The villagers exchanged uncertain glances. What could the ice possibly bring that would require such a warning? The silent woman who had been the first to arrive stepped forward. Her calm presence steadied the air, yet her words only deepened the mystery. "The shadows beneath the ice are moving," she said, "and they follow sound." The hall fell quiet. No one dared ask more. When night came, even the wind seemed to hush. The villagers barred their doors, kept their fires small, and waited for dawn. But the winter road had already begun to awaken, and whatever followed the pilgrims had drawn close enough to listen. The night that followed the pilgrims' warning settled over Brackenfold with an unnerving heaviness, as if the sky itself were listening. Usually the cold brought a comforting predictability. A clear night meant a sharp frost by morning, and a cloudy night meant softer air. But this night had neither the crisp bite of cold nor the soft cover of cloud. The air felt suspended, waiting, as though the world were holding its breath. Inside their cottages, families gathered close to their fires. Flames danced quietly, the warmth doing little to dispel the unease that had threaded through every home. Even the dogs refused to sleep. They lay with their heads raised, ears twitching at every tiny sound beyond the walls. Children whispered questions their parents struggled to answer. Why could they not play by the river anymore? What shadows moved under the ice? Why were the silent pilgrims afraid? No answers brought comfort, and so the villagers spoke in soft voices, hoping not to draw the attention of whatever lingered in the frozen dark. Before dawn, the older pilgrim and the young man who had collapsed were already prepared to leave. They stood near the edge of the river, where the dim light of early morning cast a pale sheen across the ice. They exchanged only a few quiet words with the woman who remained behind. If they felt fear, they showed none. Their cloaks caught the faint wind, their silhouettes drawn against the snow like 3 lines carved into the pale world. By the time the sun crested the low hills, the 2 pilgrims had vanished northward along the winter road. The woman stood alone, her posture still, her face hidden beneath her hood. She watched the direction her companions had gone, but gave no sign of worry. Only the tightening of her gloves suggested anything like tension. The villagers kept their distance. Though they trusted the pilgrims as guardians of a sort, Their silence made their motives difficult to read. And now, with stories of shadows beneath the ice, the line between myth and reality felt thinner than ever. That afternoon, Ulrich decided to inspect the river once more. He felt a responsibility, not only as a carpenter who knew the sound of shifting wood and cracking ice, but as a husband and father. Fear sat heavily on Elda's shoulders, and their daughter, a girl of 9, had begun waking in the night from dreams she refused to describe. Ulrich approached the river with measured steps. The woman pilgrim already stood there, her back straight, her gaze locked on the ice. She did not look at him, yet her presence brought a sense of stability, like a watcher stationed at the boundary between the known and the unknown. The river appeared ordinary at first glance. Snow dusted the frozen surface, and faint cracks spread like pale branches beneath the crust. Ulrich listened, recalling the strange tapping he had heard nights earlier. The air felt still, offering nothing but its cold breath. Then, soft and slow, came the sound. Tap, tap, tap. Not loud, not forceful, almost gentle. Ulrich stiffened. The pilgrim tilted her head slightly, as though she had been expecting it. "You hear it too," he whispered. "Yes." "What is it?" She did not answer right away. Instead, she took a step closer to the river, crouching so that her hand hovered above the ice without touching it. Her breath slowed. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a murmur. "The river is dreaming." Ulrich frowned. "Dreaming. You think ice is still, but the land remembers every winter it has survived. Sometimes the deep places stir." Her words did not clarify much, yet they carried the tone of someone who had walked through more winters than any villager here could imagine. He waited for her to continue. "It is not the river itself that worries us," she said, "but what listens through it." Again the tapping came, slightly louder this time, echoing faintly beneath their feet. A long crack shivered across the surface. Though it did not break, it spread in a slow branching line, like a pale lightning strike that stopped halfway through the frozen world. Ulrich stepped back, instinctively protective of the pilgrim, though she seemed unshaken. She rose and turned toward him. "You must trust what you hear, not what you wish were true." The advice offered little comfort. By evening, word spread through Brackenfold that the river had begun to sound again. Some villagers wanted to barricade the banks with logs and snow. Others argued that interfering might anger whatever lurked beneath. Wild theories sprouted like frost on windows. Some believed great northern beasts had awakened beneath the ice, creatures shaped by forgotten winters older than any living memory. Others blamed restless spirits said to wander the frozen plains searching for warmth. When fear grows, imagination rarely stays still. That night, Elda told Ulrich that she heard whispering beyond their cottage walls. Not voices exactly, but a thin murmur, like the sound of distant reeds brushing together. Ulrich listened for a long time with his ear against the wood. At first he heard nothing, but as the wind shifted, a faint rustling reached him. Soft, almost rhythmic. He could not tell whether it came from the river or from the frozen forest beyond it. He returned to the hearth and reassured Elda, though the tremor in her hands revealed how frightened she truly was. Their daughter clung to her blanket, staring at the window as if something watched her through the frost. The villagers slept uneasily, if they slept at all. On the following morning, the pilgrim woman gathered the villagers near the hall. Her voice remained calm, even as the tension in the village swelled. "The ice is no longer safe," she said. "You must not go near it until the others return." "When will they return?" someone asked. "When they find the source." This answer stirred more confusion than comfort. Ulrich stepped forward. "What exactly follows you?" he asked. "What moves beneath the river?" A long silence stretched before she replied. "There is something ancient in the north. It sleeps in the deepest lakes until the cold awakens it. My order listens for it. We follow the winter roads because the ice carries its voice." Ulrich swallowed. "Are these shadows under the river part of it?" "Not part," she said, "but called by it." The villagers exchanged nervous glances. Stories of ancient things were one matter when told to children beside a fire, but hearing them spoken by someone who had walked the northern roads made those tales feel far too real. By midday, the tapping returned again, louder and more frequent. The ice shuddered in long waves, like something underneath was brushing against it. Several villagers gathered at the riverbank despite the warnings, drawn by a mix of fear and curiosity. A boy of about 12 stepped forward, ignoring his frightened mother's call. He peered at the ice, pressing his ear close. Before Alric could reach him, a long crack burst across the surface. A low groaning rose from the depths, the kind of sound that seemed too deep to belong to anything living. The pilgrim woman rushed forward and pulled the child back just as a section of ice bowed inward. The villagers stumbled away, their breaths sharp and panicked. No one slept that night. And when the moon rose, pale and thin, another sound joined the tapping. A slow scraping, as if something large was sliding beneath the frozen skin of the earth, searching for a way through. The winter road was no longer silent. It was listening. And it was answering. Morning arrived with a dull and muted light, the kind that seemed reluctant to touch the village. Brackenfold lay beneath a hushed veil, as if the night had left behind a residue of unease that neither warmth nor daylight could clear. Frost coated every rooftop in a thick white layer, but the cold felt different now, no longer the familiar winter chill the villagers had lived with all their lives. This cold carried a weight to it, something deeper and more difficult to name. Alric stepped outside early, as he often did, hoping movement might quiet the restless thoughts that had kept him awake through the night. His breath rose in soft clouds as he walked across the hardened snow. Each step echoed faintly, a reminder that even the ground seemed to be listening. He paused at the edge of the path leading to the river, and found himself staring toward the ice, though he knew he would not dare approach it without the pilgrim woman. Behind him, the village stirred slowly to life. Doors opened. Fires were coaxed into warmth, but every movement carried a cautious energy, as though people feared disturbing something unseen. When the pilgrim woman appeared, she wore the same quiet resolve she always carried, but Alric sensed a new tension in her posture. She approached the river with deliberate steps, stopping several paces back from the bank. Alric joined her, though he kept an equally respectful distance. The surface of the river looked unchanged at first glance. Frost clung to it in a delicate lace. Snow lay undisturbed, yet beneath that stillness the villagers had heard it. The scraping, the tapping, the slow movement of something vast. The pilgrim lowered herself again, one knee in the snow, and placed her hand just above the ice without touching it, as she had done before. Her breath came slow and steady. "Is it stronger today?" Alric asked. She nodded once. "Yes." "What does it want?" The pilgrim hesitated. For the first time since arriving in Brackenfold, her silence felt uncertain rather than purposeful. "It wants to rise," she said after a long moment. Alric felt the words settle in his chest like a stone dropped into deep water. "Can it break through?" he asked quietly. "If the cold deepens, yes. If the ice thickens enough, yes." She stood slowly, brushing snow from the hem of her cloak. "But we may still guide its path away from your village." "Then the others, are they close?" "They will be." Her confidence should have been reassuring, but the edges of her voice held something quieter and heavier than certainty. By midday, the sky dimmed once more, the sun smothered by a pallid haze that filtered the light into a muted glow. The villagers gathered inside the hall, their breaths forming a thin mist in the cool air. The pilgrim stood before them, explaining what she could. She did not speak of monsters or spirits. Instead, she described the cold as a living force that sometimes stirred things buried deep within the land. "There are lakes in the far north, where living things do not move as you and I do," she said. "They are shaped by winters older than our histories. They sleep for long stretches of time, and when the land shifts, they drift." "Drift where?" someone asked. "Toward sound, toward warmth, toward weakness." Her words created a ripple of unease through the villagers. "You said its path can be guided," Alric reminded her. "Yes. But we must keep the river undisturbed until the others return." Whispers broke across the room. Some villagers asked if they should dig trenches. Others wondered if fires along the bank would help. The pilgrim shook her head at every suggestion. "Noise draws it," she said. "Heat draws it. Movement draws it." "Then what draws it away?" a woman asked from the back of the hall. "Stillness." Stillness was something the villagers could provide. Stillness was something they understood. That evening, the entire community emptied the fields and cleared the paths, returning to their cottages long before dusk. Fires were kept low, conversations were whispered, even the livestock grew quiet within their pens, sensing the strange hush that settled across the village. Alric sat beside the hearth with Elder and their daughter, listening to the faint crackle of the fire. He felt an odd mixture of fear and calm. fear of what lay beneath the ice, calm in the knowledge that everything was being done to keep it contained. Outside, the wind swept across the fields in slow sighs. Inside, the quiet grew heavier. When night finally arrived, it felt deeper than usual. The moon hung low and thin, its pale glow cutting through the frost with an almost fragile quality. Ulrich rose from his seat, compelled by a feeling he could not name, and approached the window. He expected darkness. Instead, he saw movement. Not from the river, but from the winter road. A dim orange glow flickered beyond the trees. It swayed gently, then multiplied into another light, then another. Figures emerged from the night, tall shapes moving steadily toward the village. As they drew nearer, Ulrich recognized their cloaks before anything else. The pilgrims had returned. He stepped outside, pulling his coat tight against the cold. Others emerged as well, drawn by the glow of the approaching lanterns. The pilgrims walked in a slow, deliberate formation. The older man from before carried a long staff, and the younger pilgrim, now recovered, moved with renewed strength. Their faces were pale from travel, but their eyes held purpose. The woman pilgrim joined them with a small nod. "Did you find it?" she asked. "We did," the older man replied. "It has wandered far from its original place. Can it be turned?" "Yes. But we must act before dawn." The villagers stood in a semicircle, watching in silence. The older pilgrim turned toward them. "You have done well to remain still," he said. "Now you must stay inside, no matter what you hear, no matter what shakes." Fear rippled through the crowd, but the pilgrims wasted no time. They gathered near the river, forming a loose circle several steps from the bank. Each held a lantern whose flame burned low and steady. They placed the lights in the snow and stood with their hands outstretched, palms down, as if feeling the ground itself. Ulrich watched from a distance, unable to look away. The ice trembled. A low vibration passed through the air, faint but deep. The tapping began again, louder, quicker. The scraping followed, a long drawn-out sound like something dragging across stone. The ice bowed subtly beneath the pressure. The pilgrims remained motionless. Then, in a moment that seemed both impossibly long and startlingly brief, the river exhaled a breath of cold, so sharp it made the air crackle. The pilgrims took one synchronized step backward. The lantern flames bent toward the north, drawn by a sudden unseen pull. Ulrich felt it too, a tug somewhere beneath his feet, as if the river itself were shifting its weight. The older pilgrim lifted his staff and pressed its end into the snow. A soft sound rose from him, a hum, steady and low, and carried on a single breath. The other pilgrims joined him, creating a layered tone that reverberated across the frozen water. The ice responded. You could feel it more than hear it. A deep movement, a long stretching, as though something beneath the surface was changing direction. Cracks blossomed outward, not toward the village, but toward the far northern bend. The scraping shifted. It moved away. Slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably away. A long moment passed before the pilgrims lowered their hands. The dragging beneath the ice softened. The tapping faded, the vibrations ceased, and the river fell still again. The older pilgrim turned toward the villagers. His voice carried no triumph, only weary relief. It will continue north. It will not trouble this place again. The villagers exhaled as one. Some cried quietly, others simply stood in stunned silence. The pilgrim woman walked toward Ulrich and Elder, offering a quiet nod. You listened, she said. That saved you. Ulrich swallowed, unsure how to respond. Nothing that belongs near people, she answered, but something the north knows well. The pilgrims gathered their lanterns, preparing once more for the winter road. The three of them stood at the edge of the village, as the moonlight caught their cloaks. Will it awaken again? Elder asked. Not for many winters, the woman said. But when it does, others will be listening. They left without ceremony, disappearing into the pale darkness just as silently as they had arrived. The villagers remained outside for a long moment, watching their figures fade along the winding road. When morning finally broke, the river lay peaceful and quiet beneath a new layer of frost. No tapping, no scraping, only stillness. Yet Ulrich found himself wondering, not with fear, but with a quiet and steady curiosity, how many other ancient things slept beneath the familiar world, waiting for winters deep enough to wake them, and how many footsteps across the centuries had gone unheard, or unremembered. The winter road stretched northward, holding its secrets, inviting only those brave or strange enough to listen. You step quietly into another corner of forgotten history now, leaving the silent winter roads behind and moving toward the slow rhythm of labor that shaped the medieval world. This story begins not with kings or lords or armies, but with a single man whose life unfolded in careful repetition. His name was Aldwin, a stonecutter born in the shadow of the great quarries that supplied half the region with building materials. His world was measured not by glory or battle, but by the steady weight of his hammer and the long patience demanded by the stones he shaped. Stonecutters were essential to medieval life, though you rarely hear about them. Every wall, every bridge, every church tower depended on their hands. Their craft moved the world forward in small increments, one block at a time. For most of them, work began before dawn and continued until the light faded. The pace was slow, but the work left behind something solid, something that could outlast the families who carved it. Aldwin came from a line of such craftsmen. His father cut stone and his father before him. They rarely traveled far because the stones themselves anchored them. The quarry lay a little more than a mile from their village, and the sound of hammers striking rock was as constant as birdsong in summer. When you lived that close, the rhythm of the quarry became almost a part of the landscape. Villagers could tell what time it was simply from the tone of the hammers. Morning strikes echoed differently than afternoon ones. Fewer tools rang out after midday meals, when workers returned with stiff arms and slowed shoulders. Aldwin's world was shaped by these small details that most people passed over without notice. The quarry walls formed layers of past seasons. He could read them the way a monk might read the worn pages of a manuscript. Lighter stone meant a summer of scarce rain. Darker streaks showed seasons of heavy storms when minerals washed deep into the rock. Even the grain of the stone reflected the years in which the land had been warm or cool. He was not a scholar, but he understood the earth in a practical way. When you spend your life cutting through layers of time, you become familiar with the quiet memory stored in the ground. Most days began the same. The workers gathered near the quarry edge before sunrise, their breath clouding in the muted morning air. They inspected their tools carefully because a cracked hammerhead or a dulled chisel could ruin both stone and limb. Aldwin favored a hammer that had belonged to his father. It was worn smooth by decades of hands, its handle darkened with oil from palms that had held it through summers and winters alike. He kept it wrapped in a piece of linen and never left it out overnight, for tools were as valuable as livestock in a stonecutter's world. Work started with the first swing. The sound of metal meeting stone carried far across the valley, rising and falling like a slow chant. Aldwin usually focused on quarried limestone, which was softer than granite, but required a steady hand to split cleanly. A single mistake could fracture an entire block, wasting hours of work. He would tap gently along a natural line in the stone, listening for a certain hollow note that told him where the split wanted to occur. Stonecutters learned to follow these natural weaknesses instead of fighting against them. In many ways, the craft asked for patience rather than strength. The villagers relied on men like Aldwin to shape their homes, yet few understood how much technique went into each stone. Even the simplest wall required a mason's careful calculations, and the stonecutter had to anticipate those needs long before the block reached a building site. Aldwin would often pause to picture where each piece would eventually rest. Some stones would become the foundations of barns, others would line wells, a few would help repair the old monastery on the hill. Knowing the purpose of each block helped him choose the right cut and grain. Still, for all the skill involved, being a stonecutter was not a celebrated profession. Their names rarely appeared in written records. Their work remained anonymous, absorbed into the history of a wall or a bridge without acknowledgement. That anonymity did not bother Aldwin. He had long understood that his place in the world was a quiet one. Some people shaped history through decisions or inventions. He shaped it through material effort, through small, incremental contributions that kept life functioning. His daily life followed simple patterns. He would eat a modest meal at midday, usually bread, a bit of cheese and watered ale. In the evenings he walked home with the other workers, their clothes coated in pale dust that clung even after washing. The dust embedded itself into their fingerprints, their hair, even the creases of their eyelids. People joked that a stonecutter aged faster, not because of hardship, but because the quarry marked them with the memory of the stones. Despite the routine, Aldwin found comfort in repetition. He believed deeply in the value of slow work, the kind that built something lasting. But the quarry, like the river in the last story, held its own quiet mysteries. Every so often, Workers uncovered objects buried deep within the rock, fossils, though they did not have that word for them, imprints of shells, the faint shapes of ancient plants, traces of a world none of them could imagine. Aldwin never dismissed these discoveries. He studied them carefully before passing them to the local cleric, who kept such items in a wooden chest. Sometimes Aldwin wondered about the great antiquity reflected in those impressions. What storms had swept across this land before villages were built? What creatures had left their marks behind? In a world where each day looked much like the one before it, these fragments of the past reminded him that time was far larger than any one life. But as one particular winter approached, something changed in the quarry. It began subtly. Aldwin noticed the stone seemed different in tone, almost more brittle. The sound of hammers echoed strangely, as though the rock beneath their feet had hollow pockets. His fellow workers mentioned that some blocks were splitting unevenly. Despite their careful technique, stone had a predictable character, shaped by its place in the earth. When that character shifted, the workers paid attention. One morning, a faint tremor moved through the quarry. It lasted only a breath, but every man felt it. They exchanged uneasy glances. The region was not known for ground movements, and even a slight tremor could be dangerous in a place where tons of suspended stone loomed above the workers' heads. The overseer insisted it was nothing, perhaps a cart passing on the distant road, or the settling of old quarry walls. Yet Aldwin sensed something different that he could not quite name. He felt it, not in the tremor itself, but in the quiet afterward, as though the earth were adjusting to something deep within itself. Within a few days the tremors came again, slightly stronger. Dust drifted from the upper edges of the quarry, the fine powder scattering like pale mist in the morning sun. Still, the workers returned each day, because the quarry had always been reliable. The stones might shift, but the work remained necessary. Then came a morning unlike any other. When Aldwin arrived, several workers stood near the eastern wall, murmuring among themselves. A long, jagged crack had appeared overnight, running vertically down the face of the stone. It stretched from the upper ledges all the way to the quarry floor. Something like that did not form under normal conditions. A crack of that length suggested pressure building from within the rock, pressure that had not existed before. The overseer ordered the men to keep clear of the area, but curiosity pulled them closer. Aldwin inspected the crack with the quiet attention he always gave to stone. He touched the surface lightly. It felt colder than usual, almost unnaturally so, as if the temperature deep inside the rock had dropped in a way the outer air could not explain. He pressed his ear against the stone. What he heard was faint. So faint he doubted it at first. A soft murmur. Not a voice. Not a tremor. More like the sound of shifting grains deep inside a vast weight of earth. Something settling. Something adjusting. Something preparing for change. He stepped back slowly, his expression steady but thoughtful. The other men asked what he had heard, but Aldwin did not know how to describe it. He only said that the stone was moving, and the overseer dismissed the comment with a wave of his hand. Work resumed that day, though with visible caution. Every strike of a hammer sounded sharper. Every fragment of falling dust made the men flinch. Stonecutters rarely feared their craft, but they respected it deeply, and respect often translated into prudence. By afternoon, Aldwin noticed more changes. The quarry floor seemed subtly uneven, in places where it had always been level. A few tools vibrated slightly when placed on the ground. He found a hairline crack running beneath one of the heavy timber supports. Even the sound of hammer strikes had shifted in pitch. He knelt and touched the ground again. The vibration was faint but steady. Something beneath the quarry was shifting, though no one knew what or why. That evening, Aldwin walked home more slowly than usual, the weight of the day settling into his shoulders. His wife asked why he seemed troubled, and he answered only that the stone felt restless. She offered him stew and warm bread, but even food did little to settle his thoughts. The quarry had been stable all his life. It had been stable during his father's time, and his grandfather's. Stone did not change quickly. For it to shift now meant something deeper was unfolding. As he lay awake that night, listening to the distant wind, Aldwin wondered how the land could hold so many stories beneath its surface, stories carried across seasons he could never witness. If the quarry held the memory of storms and ancient seas, what else might be hidden within the layers of stone, and what might be trying to rise from the depths after so many silent centuries? This question followed him into sleep and lingered still when he woke. Something, he felt, was beginning. But what exactly was moving beneath the quarry floor as the cracks spread and the ground hummed ever so faintly? And what would happen if the stone finally answered back? You wake again within the slow pulse of the medieval fortress, though now the atmosphere has shifted. The first section allowed you to meet the planners, the scribes, the thinkers who shaped a castle on parchment long before stone met earth. But drawings alone never raised a tower. Behind every curtain wall and every arrow slit stood a host of hands whose names were rarely recorded. This section invites you to walk among them and observe their routines, their quiet burdens, their repetitive tasks that gave these structures their eventual form. Much of their labor was uncelebrated, but without it no castle would have risen higher than a foundation trench. The earliest to arrive at a construction site each morning were the quarrymen. They worked far from the visible progress of the building itself, cutting into hillsides or exposed rock beds, where nature had stored material suitable for fortifications. Quarrying was a patient craft, heavy with physical strain yet guided by precision. The workers loosened stone with iron chisels and wedges, inserting wooden pegs that they soaked with water. As the wood expanded, cracks spread slowly across the chosen block until it separated from the larger mass with a steady sound. Day after day they repeated the same pattern, tapping and prying until stone after stone lay ready on the ground. You can almost picture the quiet rhythm of that scene. There were no modern engines to blast or saw, only iron tools, muscle, and the consistent judgment of men who had learned to read small fractures in rock like lines in an aging face. For these workers, time was a steady companion. They measured progress, not in dramatic bursts, but in the gradual march of blocks freed from the earth. It was dull in its way, a long cycle of predictable motions, but it was dependable work, and its consistency made the rising walls of a castle possible. Once the blocks had been shaped enough for travel, teams of oxen or horses hauled them toward the building site using heavy carts. Animals strained along dirt tracks worn by repeated journeys. The track itself could become part of the long-term landscape. Some routes that supported castle construction later became permanent roads. The workers walked beside the carts, guiding the animals, adjusting ropes, or clearing branches from the path. These repetitive tasks held a kind of quiet endurance. If the stones did not arrive, the masons had nothing to build with. At the construction site, the true assembly line of medieval engineering unfolded. The master mason directed everything. Around him, layers of workers formed a natural hierarchy. The most skilled shaped the final stones with delicate accuracy. Others lifted, carried, fetched, stacked, or mixed. The mallet and chisel never really fell silent. You might imagine the steady rhythm, like a muted drum, echoing against half-finished walls. Within this setting the mortar makers earned little attention, yet performed crucial work. Mortar held the entire structure together, binding stone to stone with reliable strength. Creating good mortar demanded patience. Lime had to be burned and cooled. Sand had to be sifted and stored. Water had to be measured carefully. Each ingredient mattered. A laborer might spend the entire day shoveling sand into a sieve, or stirring a thick mixture in a trough. These were repetitive motions, simple and predictable, but if the mixture was wrong the walls weakened. A single batch mixed too thinly could undo weeks of work. It is one of the many hidden truths of these fortresses, that the workers who seemed farthest from glory often carried the heaviest weight of responsibility. Above the masons and laborers, the carpenters constructed the scaffolding that allowed upward progress. Every pole, board, platform, and wooden frame had to be cut and fitted on the spot. Carpenters also built the machines that lifted stone. The treadwheel crane, for example, functioned through human effort alone. A worker walked inside a large wooden wheel, using his own weight to turn the mechanism. As the wheel rotated it pulled a rope wound around an axle, lifting stone blocks upward with slow determination. This labor was repetitive and physically demanding, but for many workers it was simply part of their daily life. Imagine stepping close to this crane. Inside the wheel a man walks with measured steps. The wheel creaks beneath him. His pace never changes. The rope tenses gradually as a stone rises into the air. Other workers steady the load, guiding it across the site. There is no urgency, only steady cooperation. It is a choreographed movement, practiced and slow, which repeats throughout the day. Without scenes like this, castles would never have grown above the height of a single story. On the ground, the tool carriers moved constantly between work areas. They picked up chisels to sharpen them, returned with newly honed edges, fetched buckets of water, sorted piles of timber, and relayed instructions. Their tasks seem almost invisible, yet they kept the site functional. In the world of castle construction, interruption was a real threat. A missing tool could halt an entire crew. The carriers prevented such delays, though they seldom received recognition for their attention. Women also contributed to castle building, though their roles varied depending on region and season. In some places they assisted with carrying water or preparing food for workers. In others they took part in mixing mortar or transporting smaller stones. Documentary records mention payments to women laborers for tasks such as washing linens used by masons or gathering brushwood for lime burning. Their contributions may have seemed small, but they formed part of the unseen structure that supported the work. Meals were simple, usually eaten near the site. Workers consumed bread, small portions of cheese, onions, and ale. The food was plain, sometimes repetitive, always functional. The purpose was not comfort, but sustenance. The workers needed steady energy for long days. They rarely left the site, except to sleep. Castle building required a kind of temporary village around itself, full of huts, tents, and wooden shelters, where workers lived during the construction years. Entire communities formed around these long projects, communities that dissolved once the final stones settled into their places. Life inside these temporary settlements followed patterns of simplicity. Workers repaired their tools at night, or mended clothing. They exchanged stories from their home villages, or discussed small concerns such as weather changes, wages, or the quality of materials. Their conversations rarely touched on the broader political or military reasons behind the castle. Those matters belonged to the elite. For the workers, the castle was a livelihood. It was a long project offering steady wages and predictable tasks. Such stability was not always easy to find. Because the work was long-term, many workers formed lasting friendships. A mason might spend years beside the same partner, shaping similar stones each day. Their cooperation became almost instinctive. They knew how each other moved, when to lift, when to shift pressure, when to pause. These relationships were rarely written about, yet they shaped the final structure more than any single decision by a noble or architect. Weather influenced the pace of progress. Rain made mortar unreliable. Frost made stone brittle. Wind threatened the scaffolding. Workers adapted constantly. They covered piles of sand with cloth, shielded lime pits, tied ropes more securely, or waited until conditions improved. Much of castle construction required patience, and this patience grew from the understanding that nature often had the final word. As the walls rose higher, skilled masons carved details such as window arches or staircases. These features demanded concentration. Measurements were made with simple tools. A single mistake could misalign an entire section. Yet the workers relied on surprisingly few instruments. Their accuracy came from long experience. Many had begun as apprentices in their early teens and spent their entire lives mastering stone. The castle reflected decades of accumulated craft that passed silently from one generation to the next. Archers, soldiers, and guards occasionally visited the site, especially when the castle was intended for military use. Their presence reminded the workers that the structure had a purpose beyond daily labor, yet the workers may not have felt deeply connected to this purpose. The castle was not built for them, it was built for lords, heirs, and defenders of territory. Still, the workers shaped its every stone, and their imprint lingered long after the noble families who ordered the construction had vanished from memory. By the time a castle reached its final height, thousands of hands had touched its stones. Some workers had come and gone. Others had spent entire winters and summers at the site. The process created a shared history, though the individuals involved rarely received acknowledgement. Their names faded, but the physical work endured. You might find yourself wondering what it felt like to watch a castle reach completion after years of repetitive effort. Did the workers feel pride, or were they simply relieved to move on to the next job that offered wages? Their thoughts remain unrecorded. Yet the fortress they left behind stood as a testament to their patience. Its strength rested not only on mortar and stone, but on the steady rhythm of hands that shaped and lifted and carried day after day. As you consider this hidden workforce, another quiet question arises. How many of these workers ever returned to see the castle once it stood fully finished, fully armed, fully alive with people who would never know the names of those who built it? You stand once more in the quiet world of castle construction, though now the site feels different. The foundation has settled, the walls have risen, and the steady rhythm of hammers and chisels has grown slower, more refined. This is the final stage of building a medieval castle, the part where patience becomes as essential as stone. You have seen how plans were drawn and how anonymous workers shaped raw earth and rock into structure. Now you step into the last stretch of this long process, where smaller details, final adjustments, and the careful closing of unfinished tasks bring the fortress into its completed form. This stage rarely receives attention in historical records. People remember when the first stones were laid, and they remember the day the castle was declared finished, often with a simple note in a charter or ledger. But between those points lay countless small tasks, the sort of work that was not dramatic enough to document yet essential for the structure's survival. Those tasks make up the landscape of this final section. At this late point in construction, most large stones were already set in place. Workers now focused on the areas that would define how the fortress functioned in daily life. The masons carved stairways that spiraled upward inside towers. These stairways wound in a clockwise direction more often than not, giving defenders an advantage if forced to retreat upward. The steps were uneven by design, with slightly varied heights to hinder attackers unfamiliar with the rhythm. Every one of those steps took time to carve and fit, and every one required a mason's judgment. The carpenters worked beside the masons, shaping beams and doors and roofing frames. The wooden structures inside a castle often required as much care as the stonework. Roof beams had to be positioned carefully, ensuring that rainwater flowed where it needed to. Floors had to be fitted and reinforced to bear the weight of furniture, supplies, or garrison equipment. Kitchens needed their own arrangements for smoke, heat, and storage. These details may sound plain, but without them, a castle was simply a shell. The carpenters repeated the same motions day after day, shaving wood, measuring lengths, adjusting joints. They worked through the seasons until the interior began to take shape. While the walls continued to rise, the workers also turned their attention to the outer features of defense. Battlements were constructed at the top of curtain walls, providing alternating raised and lowered sections that allowed archers to observe from cover. Each raised section, known as a merlon, required precise placement. Each lowered gap, through which arrows could be fired, had to align with the overall pattern. These features were not decorative. They shaped how defenders could move along the wall in times of danger. Arrow loops, narrow vertical slits carved into towers or walls, were also part of this stage. They allowed archers to shoot from inside while remaining mostly protected. Creating them required careful measurement. If the opening was too wide, the defender became exposed. If it was too narrow, the shot angle was limited. Workers spent entire days shaping these openings, adjusting their angles so the defenders could cover approaching ground with reliable lines of sight. Meanwhile, the roofers climbed among the highest structures of the site. They laid tiles or wooden shingles one after another, often working in colder air than those below. Their work seemed simple, but it demanded consistency. A misplaced tile could allow water to seep into beams. Over time, such moisture could weaken the entire structure. Roofers learned to read weather patterns closely, stopping work when the risk of slipping grew too high. Many castles bore the marks of their patience long after the workers themselves had faded from memory. Inside the walls, plasterers began covering rough stone with smooth layers made from lime, sand, and water. The material dried slowly, requiring repeated applications. Rooms gradually lost their raw appearance. The interior of a medieval castle was not always the cold stone image that modern imagination prefers. Many spaces were finished with a pale, smooth surface that reflected limited light from torches or windows. The plasterers did not work quickly. They followed the pace of drying lime, which waited for no one, and required long hours to settle. Alongside them, smiths installed metal fittings for doors, hinges for shutters, brackets for shelves, and rings for torches. Every doorway needed its own set of latches. Every gate required iron straps to strengthen the wood. All of these items were forged by hand. The smiths hammered iron bars on their anvils, heating them repeatedly in charcoal fires. The sound of striking metal spread across the site, an echo that lasted through the final year of building. This work was repetitive and plain, yet it formed the hidden skeleton of daily life within the fortress. The construction site also remained full of the smells of lime, cut timber, and hot iron. Workers grew accustomed to these smells. They could tell when lime had been mixed properly, or when timber had dried long enough to use, simply by scent. Sensory familiarity shaped much of their judgment. Nothing about these tasks was glamorous. Much of it was slow, methodical, and uneventful. Yet it laid the foundation for the castle's durability. As the structure neared completion, supervisors walked the site more frequently. They looked for areas where the mortar had dried unevenly, or where stone edges did not sit flush. They checked joints in timber frames and tested doors. These inspections were simple, but they often revealed work that needed revisiting. At this late stage, correcting mistakes required further patience. Workers might have to remove stones, reposition beams, or reapply plaster. Such corrections slowed progress, but they ensured that the final structure endured. Outside the walls, laborers cleared the surrounding ground. Loose stones, broken wood, and discarded lime fragments were gathered and removed. Some were repurposed for smaller building tasks. Others were piled in heaps that later served no purpose beyond marking the former boundary of the construction site. The land around the castle gradually shifted from a busy workspace to the more orderly terrain expected of a completed fortification. Temporary huts were taken apart. Tools were collected or redistributed. The community of workers prepared to disperse. Inside the growing castle, water systems received attention. Wells were dug, if the site permitted it. In some cases, the water source already existed, and merely needed reinforcement. In others, water had to be collected from nearby streams using channels or storage basins. These systems were humble but essential. Water determined whether a castle could endure a siege. Workers lined the well shafts with stone, and reinforced the openings so that future buckets would not wear down the edges. It was tedious work, often carried out by specialists who understood how to stabilize a vertical shaft. Food storage areas were also completed. Granaries, pantries, or undercroft chambers needed controlled airflow so that stored items would not spoil. Workers carved small openings into walls, placed wooden screens, and checked how air moved through the space during warmer afternoons. These mundane adjustments mattered more than many other features of the castle, especially during long winters or times of conflict. A single misjudged vent could turn supplies musty and useless. When the structure was almost ready for occupation, painters sometimes entered to decorate certain chambers, usually for the lord and his family. Their work rarely resembled later artistic styles. Instead, it consisted of simple patterns, repeating shapes and pale colors, designed to brighten otherwise dim interiors. The paints were mixed from minerals and plant materials, prepared in small quantities each day. This stage of work was reserved for the more private rooms. The majority of the castle remained plain and functional. At last the day arrived when the workers set down their tools for the final time. Some castles held a small ceremony marking completion, though many did not. More often the ending was quiet. The master mason recorded the final wages, settled accounts for materials, and dismissed the workers. They gathered their belongings, said farewell to friends made through years of shared labor, and walked away from the structure they had helped raise. Some would never see it again. From this point onward, the castle passed into the world of those who would live within it. Servants moved in to prepare rooms. Guards took their posts along the battlements. Hunters, kitchen workers, and stable hands began shaping daily life. The noble family arrived last, stepping into a building that to them felt newly born. Yet the castle carried within its walls the long, silent story of the workers who had created it. Their names were seldom remembered, yet their patience remained in every corner. Over the years that followed, the castle might be repaired, expanded, or reinforced. Weather would test the strength of the masonry. Seasons would challenge the wooden structures, but the core of the building, shaped by those slow and patient hands, endured. The workers had built, not for applause, but for function, for durability, for the weight of time itself. As you step back from this finished fortress, the question arises quietly: how many of the people who built it ever imagined the lives that would unfold inside it long after they were gone? The castle stood firm, but the stories of its makers faded into the background. And so you are left to wonder how many other monuments across history hold the silent traces of workers whose names we will never know. You step now into a quieter corner of medieval life. A world often overlooked yet essential to daily existence. The flickering light that allowed people to navigate darkness. In the cathedral city of Ely, a man named Osric dedicated his life to the making of candles. The work itself might seem mundane, but in a time before gas or electricity, candles were the lifeblood of households, workshops, monasteries, and markets. Without them, the rhythm of daily life slowed dramatically once the sun disappeared. Osric was neither wealthy nor noble. His family had lived in Ely for generations, earning a modest living through small trades. Candle making was not a prestigious profession, yet it offered a predictable livelihood. Each day required careful preparation and exacting attention to detail. Beeswax was the most prized material, though tallow, rendered from animal fat, was used widely for those who could not afford the sweeter scent and cleaner burn of wax. Osric, like other craftsmen, often blended the two to balance cost and quality. The first part of his day began long before sunrise. He would rise in the chill of the early morning, when the air carried frost, and the streets of Ely were silent, except for the occasional clatter of a cart or the distant crowing of a rooster. His workshop was a small timber-framed building near the market square, its walls lined with shelves holding molds, wicks, and containers of wax. A small hearth in the corner provided heat for melting, and the glow from the fire lent the room a gentle warmth that contrasted with the biting morning air. Melting wax required patience. Beeswax was cut into small pieces and placed over a double boiler of sorts, heated gently to avoid scorching. Tallow, denser and more prone to impurity, demanded careful skimming to remove residual particles. The smell of warm fat mingled with the subtle aroma of wax. For anyone unaccustomed, it might seem unpleasant, yet for Osric it was a familiar scent, a sign that the day's work was beginning. Once the wax reached the right temperature, the careful process of dipping and molding began. Each candle required a wick, usually linen or hemp, twisted and trimmed to a precise length. Osric would immerse the wick repeatedly, allowing thin layers of wax to build up gradually. The repetition demanded steady hands and quiet concentration. Too fast, and the candle would bend or crack. Too slow, and the wax would cool unevenly, leaving imperfections. For hours, the workshop filled with the soft, sticky sheen of liquid wax clinging to wick after wick. In addition to hand dipping, molds were used for specific purposes. Cylindrical shapes for monasteries, smaller tapers for domestic use, and wider pillars for special occasions required molds of carved wood or poured clay. Once filled, the wax had to cool slowly, lest the candles shrink and deform. Osric often monitored them for hours, tapping gently on their sides to detect air pockets or uneven contraction. The work was repetitive and patient, the sort of labor that might feel boring to an outsider, but in that repetition lay a rhythm, a quiet connection to centuries of craft. Orders often arrived from the cathedral, whose vast halls required long-lasting light. Monks walked through shadowed corridors, reading scriptures or performing chants, and the candles Osric made provided the illumination necessary for such rituals. Each candle was placed with care, often in holders suspended from ceilings or standing on ornate iron sconces. In winter, when nights stretched long, the cathedral relied almost entirely on these steady sources of light. One weak or poorly made candle could cast shadows that disrupted readings or ceremonies, which placed a quiet weight of responsibility on Osric's work. The candle-maker's life intertwined with the rhythms of the city in subtle ways. Markets would bustle as tradespeople brought tallow, flax for wicks and honey for beeswax. Carters and porters carried raw materials from surrounding villages. Osric traded with local merchants, balancing supply with orders. Any miscalculation could leave him short-handed, unable to supply monasteries or households in need. His day was often punctuated by trips to weigh and purchase, inspect quality, and negotiate prices. These errands were unremarkable in themselves, but they were part of the invisible network that allowed medieval cities to function. Family life occurred within the same walls. Osric's wife, Elswith, managed the household and prepared simple meals, porridge, bread, cheese, sometimes a bit of salted meat. Their children, if they were old enough, would help in small ways, rolling wicks or sorting finished candles. Each task, no matter how minor, taught them the rhythm and discipline necessary for survival in a city that demanded both skill and patience. The children learned early that progress often came slowly, and that small, careful contributions mattered as much as the grand gestures of nobility or clergy. Evenings brought a quiet reward. After the day's labor, Osric might sit beside the hearth, examining the finished candles. Their soft, pale sheen promised steady burn and gentle light. He would trim wicks, polish imperfections, and store them carefully. Outside, Ely settled into its night. The streets were empty, except for occasional travelers, the howling of dogs, and the distant sound of the river winding through the flat fenlands. Inside, the workshop exuded warmth and a faint sweetness, a refuge from the darkness beyond. Yet, despite the routine, small uncertainties always lingered. Beeswax supplies could fail, markets could fluctuate, or a fire could destroy a week's work in an instant. Each day carried an undercurrent of fragility. Still, Osric persisted. He understood that his craft was not celebrated, but it was essential. Without steady light, the city's work could not continue, nor could the ceremonies of the cathedral unfold. The quiet, repetitive labor of candle-making mattered more than most people realized. And sometimes, late at night, when the workshop was still, and the candles cast a warm glow across the room, Osric would pause and watch the flame dance. He might reflect on the centuries of unnamed hands who had performed the same labor, shaping wax and wick to illuminate the lives of others. The work seemed mundane, even boring, yet it was woven into the continuity of life itself. Every flicker of light reminded him that survival, patience and attention to small details were the true measures of human endurance. But as he observed the flame, a thought sometimes struck him: how many of these lights would endure a full night without flickering, and how many would struggle against drafts, impurities, or imperfect wax? How many moments of illumination depended entirely on steady hands working silently, hour after hour, day after day? The question lingered in the flickering shadows, unresolved, and it would follow him to the next day, as he began again, dipping, molding, and trimming, shaping light for a world that could not function without it. Morning arrived slowly in Ely, with a pale sun filtering through mist that clung to the flat fenlands surrounding the city. You stepped back into Osric's world, now observing not only his hands but the network his work supported, a quiet, interdependent system that few outside the city ever noticed. Candles, after all, were not simply tools. They were part of life, woven into domestic routines, commerce, worship, and even city governance. Without steady light, the rhythm of the city would falter, and Osric's labor was essential in ways invisible to the casual observer. Osric's morning began in much the same way as any other, though the scale of demand had grown. Orders from the cathedral had increased: more long tapers for evening vespers, wider pillars for special ceremonies, and small devotional candles for the monks' private cells. On the secular side, wealthier households requested scented wax, often mixed with beeswax and a hint of honey or herbs. Each order brought its own demands. The cathedral preferred consistency, predictable length and burn time. Domestic clients were less concerned with precision, but desired quality that reflected their status. Meeting both needs required careful planning and steady repetition. To manage the workload, Osric relied on a small circle of helpers. Each child, apprentice, and assistant had a defined role. One would roll wicks, while another prepared molds. One young helper might be responsible solely for trimming the finished candles, ensuring the wick was centered and even. Osric moved among them quietly, observing each task, correcting gently where necessary. He rarely raised his voice. Discipline was maintained through calm oversight and the natural rhythm of work, not through punishment or loud commands. By midday, the workshop hummed with quiet activity. The smell of molten tallow mingled with faint honeyed beeswax. The dipping vat glimmered, reflecting pale light through the open windows. Every immersion of a wick built up layers slowly, deliberately. Repetition was not tedious for Osric. It was a form of meditation. His attention was total, even as he listened to the faint noises of the street outside, the clip-clop of horses' hooves, the distant murmur of water from the nearby river, the creak of timber doors in the marketplace. Orders sometimes arrived unexpectedly from further afield. Traveling merchants brought requests for candles that could last weeks or months, to be used in markets or in distant manor houses. Osric packed these with careful labeling, tying each with twine and noting the type of wax and approximate burn time. The consistency of his work ensured that the light reaching homes or inns miles away was reliable. Even if the customer never saw the maker, the candle would perform its quiet function night after night. Beyond his workshop, the candles influenced city life in subtle ways. Street lamps were rare, but in wealthier areas, candles illuminated windows. Shopkeepers relied on them to extend business hours after dark. In homes, a single candle allowed families to complete tasks that daylight had interrupted: sewing, preparing meals, reading letters, or tending to children. In the cathedral, monks relied on precise illumination for reading manuscripts. Even the faintest misalignment in wick length or wax purity could disrupt their ability to complete hours of prayer. Light, in this sense, became a quiet anchor for daily activity. Osric understood the fragility of this system. A poor batch of wax, a wick too short, or improper mixing could shorten a candle's life, leaving a reader or cook in darkness. He had seen the consequences of error: a monk interrupting chance to replace a burnt-out taper, a household fumbling in gloom, or a market candle collapsing mid-use. Such small failures rippled through the city in ways few would record, yet the reliance on steady light was constant and absolute. This awareness deepened Osric's careful attention to detail. He recorded the size, weight, and type of each candle he produced. He experimented subtly with wax blends, noting how mixtures of beeswax and tallow burned differently in humid weather, or how wick thickness affected flame stability. Each experiment was minor, but it reflected an understanding of subtle variables, a knowledge born from patience and observation rather than formal instruction. In a sense, he was both craftsman and scientist, quietly manipulating materials to achieve predictable outcomes. As the afternoon wore on, Osric would sometimes step outside the workshop to collect beeswax or tallow from nearby merchants. The streets of Ely had a rhythm of their own, dictated by markets, deliveries, and movement of carts. He moved carefully, aware of time and weight. Transporting wax was delicate, too much heat could soften it, too little, and it might harden before reaching the workshop. Every step required careful attention to the mundane details of daily life that, when overlooked, could disrupt the entire system of light. Even the children in the workshop were learning lessons that extended beyond candle making. They began to understand planning, attention to sequence, and subtle observation of materials. They saw how a small error in layering wax could ruin a day's work. They felt how the slightest misalignment of wick could alter the stability of flame, and they understood that labor, repeated day after day, had consequences far beyond immediate visibility. As evening approached, Osric prepared the candles for inspection. Each was tested briefly, lit to observe burn rate and flame behavior. Imperfect candles were remelted or reworked. Those that passed were stored carefully. The room took on a soft glow, the accumulated effort of hours reflecting back at him in small points of light. Outside, the sun dipped beneath the horizon, leaving shadows to creep across Ely's streets. With the proper illumination prepared, life could continue uninterrupted. By nightfall, the city's reliance on Osric and his work became evident. Monks lit tapers in their cells. Families extended household chores by candlelight. Market stalls were brightened for late arrivals. Even those unaware of the craftsman's hand depended on the steady, reliable function of each candle. A single point of failure could ripple through multiple households, affecting meals, study, prayer, and communication. Osric often paused at night to consider this quiet network of reliance. It was invisible, mostly unrecorded, yet profoundly real. His work formed a bridge between the mundane and the essential, and yet, for all its importance, it remained largely unnoticed. People noticed when light failed, but seldom recognized the labor that had made it possible. This tension between visibility and necessity became a central rhythm in his life. As he extinguished the hearth in the workshop, Osric reflected on the flickering shadows cast by the remaining candles. Each flame represented hours of measured work, subtle choices, and patient repetition. Each light was both a tool and a symbol, small, reliable, and necessary. Yet he could not help wondering what unseen aspects of life depended on the invisible labor of craftsmen like him across the region. How many moments of security, learning, and survival relied on careful hands shaping materials too ordinary for most to notice. And as darkness filled Ely, Osric knew he would rise again the next morning, repeating the labor with steady patience, shaping light for a city that moved, unknowingly, in the glow of his work. Night had fallen over Ely, settling across the flat fenlands in a soft, almost complete darkness. The streets were silent, broken only by the occasional distant bark of a dog or the splash of water along the riverbanks. In the midst of this, Osric's work took on its quiet significance. The candles he had prepared over weeks and months now served their ultimate purpose. They carried light into spaces otherwise unreachable, sustaining life, labor, and worship long after the sun had disappeared. This was the culmination of a craftsman's patient toil, the invisible but enduring impact of routine, repetition, and quiet diligence. Even in the simplest of households, candles allowed for continuity of life. The baker could continue kneading dough, the tailor could stitch through the lengthening night, and families could share meals that required light for preparation and consumption. Each flame was a small but critical anchor, stabilizing routines that would have otherwise faltered in darkness. Osric's work had shaped these moments, quietly, deliberately, and without need for recognition. His candles were not merely functional, they were instruments of stability in a world where the absence of light could halt work, study, or even prayer. In the cathedral, the impact of Osric's labor was perhaps even more pronounced. Monks and clerics relied on consistent illumination to read sacred texts, copy manuscripts, and perform rituals. Long hours of chanting and meditation were possible only because a candle burned steadily in front of them, its flame unaffected by minor drafts or impurities in the wax. One misstep, a wick too short, a poorly mixed batch, could disrupt this rhythm, forcing adjustments that echoed throughout the schedule of prayer and study. Yet Osric had ensured that such failures were rare, and that light remained constant. Here the significance of patient repetition became visible. The monks, though they never knew the maker, depended entirely on the work he performed. Yet there were vulnerabilities. Candle wax could spoil, wicks could fail, and drafts could extinguish light prematurely. This fragility reminded Osric that the quiet systems of daily life were delicate, their continuity resting upon careful attention to details invisible to most people. His labor might appear monotonous, yet it carried responsibility that few others bore. In the seemingly trivial act of shaping wax, Osric held a measure of control over countless other lives. Small, careful acts, layering wax evenly, centering the wick, ensuring purity, translated directly into reliability for others. It was a kind of quiet mastery, invisible but essential. Beyond individual households and religious centers, Osric's work contributed to the functioning of the city itself. Markets extended into evening hours, enabled by flickering candlelight. Craftsmen continued to work on repairs or projects that required detailed vision. Public gatherings or minor civic ceremonies relied upon illumination for safety and participation. A candle might seem insignificant compared to stone walls, bridges, or the distant towers of castles, yet without it, the rhythm of city life slowed. In this way, Osric participated in shaping the broader social fabric of Ely, a network of reliance that stretched beyond the walls of his workshop. As weeks turned into months, Osric reflected on the nature of his craft. Repetition, patience, and attention to small details had become the foundation of his life. Each day followed the same measured steps: preparation of wax, creation of wicks, dipping or molding, inspection, storage, and dispatch. To an observer, his life might appear boring, unremarkable, even invisible. Yet the consequences of his diligence were profound. Light persisted where darkness could have halted work, study, or worship. Stability endured where chaos might have spread. The small acts of a single man influenced countless others, each dependent on his consistency. Over time, apprentices and family members learned the rhythm of the workshop. They observed, imitated, and internalized the same careful habits. The knowledge Osric had accumulated would pass quietly to others, perpetuating both skill and patience. These young workers rarely contemplated the broader impact of their labor. Yet, unknowingly, they became part of the same invisible network that shaped Ely's daily life. The persistence of small repetitive acts, layer upon layer, wick after wick, was now woven into the continuity of the city. Even after a long day, Osric would sometimes sit quietly by the hearth, candles casting pale light across the room. The flames flickered in the gentle breeze that crept through the workshop, and he watched, almost meditatively, as shadows danced across walls lined with shelves of wax and tools. Each candle represented hours of measured work, careful attention, and slow, deliberate repetition. Each flame was a small beacon, fragile yet enduring, illuminating spaces that required the quiet labor of unseen hands. This reflection, unspoken but profound, defined the rhythm of his existence. The last thought that lingered, as Osric prepared to rest, was a quiet consideration of human reliance on small, almost invisible efforts. How many moments of life, from household chores to sacred rituals, depended on labor that went unnoticed? How many systems, both simple and complex, persisted only because of steady, repetitive work performed without recognition or reward? And yet, in this anonymity, there was a quiet satisfaction. The endurance of light, sustained by careful hands, carried its own kind of immortality. As sleep claimed him, the candles he had made burned steadily throughout the night. Their light was soft, even, and unassuming. Yet it enabled the city to persist in its routines, its work, and its prayer. The flame would eventually diminish, one by one, but the systems and habits established by Osric's careful, patient labor would endure far longer. In a world often dominated by dramatic events, battles or power struggles, it was in these quiet, repetitive acts, layer upon layer of wax, measured attention to detail, that life in Ely continued uninterrupted. In this, the mundane became essential, and the invisible work of one man shaped the rhythm of countless lives. And so, as you drift from the candle-lit rooms of Ely, you are left with a simple reflection. Sometimes the most enduring contributions to human life are invisible, repetitive, and painstakingly ordinary. They are carried out in silence, yet their impact resonates far beyond the moment, quietly shaping the future in ways no single observer could measure. Imagine yourself now in a quieter corner of medieval London, where the streets are narrow, muddy, and winding, merchants' carts creak over uneven stones, and the faint smell of smoke and tallow drifts from nearby homes and workshops. In this world of commerce, crime, and fragile property, the concept of security had begun to take a surprisingly sophisticated form. Locks, keys, and the people who made them were central to the protection of goods, homes, and personal safety. Today, we focus on one such locksmith, a man named Godric, whose life revolved around metal, mechanics, and the quiet art of safeguarding the belongings of his neighbors. Godric's shop was modest, tucked between a baker and a tanner along a narrow alley. Its timbered walls contained shelves cluttered with iron bars, half-forged keys, and small wooden boxes filled with intricate lock parts. Unlike blacksmiths who made tools, horseshoes, or armor, Godric specialized in a craft that few outside his profession understood. Each lock he created was a puzzle in miniature, combining iron, spring mechanisms, and precise cuts that would thwart casual thieves. Though the work seemed mundane, it required concentration, patience, and a familiarity with materials that only years of repetition could develop. The day began with inspection. Godric examined unfinished locks left from the previous day. He ran his fingers over small surfaces, checking for imperfections in the iron, misalignments in the internal levers, or rough edges that might prevent a key from turning smoothly. The work was repetitive and unglamorous, yet each tiny adjustment mattered. A single misaligned lever could render a lock useless, and a faulty lock might compromise the security of a wealthy merchant or a home in the city. In medieval London, where theft was a constant threat, reliability was crucial. Once the materials were checked, Godric moved to the forge. Iron bars were heated until red hot, and then hammered into the necessary shapes. Unlike the dramatic smithing seen in armories, this work required delicate, measured force. Keys were carefully filed, bits shaped with precision, and wards fitted so that only a correctly crafted key could operate the lock. Every hammer strike, every file stroke, demanded concentration. There was no room for haste. The process was slow, deliberate, and meticulous, a dance of metal and patience. Customers arrived at irregular intervals. Some brought broken locks from their homes or shops, seeking repair. Others requested entirely new mechanisms to protect valuables or secure doors. Merchants often requested a lock that could be opened only with a single key, a feature that required careful internal alignment and careful consideration of tolerances. Godric would spend hours adjusting tumblers, ensuring smooth movement while maintaining security. The work was repetitive, exacting, and quietly thrilling to those who understood its subtleties. Apprentices assisted with simpler tasks, filing, polishing, or arranging materials. Though seemingly minor, these chores were essential. Each apprentice learned the rhythm of the shop, the heating of iron, the gentle hammering, the filing of wards, and the careful fitting of pins. Through repetition, they absorbed lessons that could not be taught in words alone. Metal spoke to them, revealing inconsistencies, weaknesses, and the proper path to craft a secure lock. In this environment, patience and attention to detail were as valuable as strength or agility. Evening often brought quiet reflection. Godric would examine locks freshly completed, testing them repeatedly. Keys were inserted, turned, removed, and inspected. Each mechanism had to operate flawlessly, resisting tampering while functioning smoothly for authorized users. Outside, the streets darkened. Torches flickered in doorways, and city life slowed as merchants closed shops and families retreated indoors. Yet within the workshop, light from the forge and candle lamps illuminated the small, meticulous world of lockmaking, a world essential to the safety and functioning of a medieval city. The importance of this craft extended beyond individual homes. Guilds, religious institutions, and even city officials depended on reliable locks. Treasury chests, records, and sacred relics required protection. Godric's work, largely invisible to the public, enabled these systems to function securely. Without such craftsmanship, theft, fraud, and disorder could spread, disrupting both commerce and social stability. It was a quiet but significant contribution, rooted in patience, repetition, and technical skill. As night approached, Godric cleaned his tools, inspected materials for the next day, and recorded details in a small ledger: orders completed, repairs made, new commissions noted. Each entry reflected a cycle of labor that was largely invisible but had far-reaching consequences. His work was not celebrated, yet it was indispensable. It was the kind of life in which repetition, attention to detail, and careful skill shaped the safety and order of an entire urban community. Even as he extinguished the forge and prepared to leave, a lingering thought remained. How many lives, possessions, and moments of commerce depended entirely on the quiet skill of one man working with iron, fire, and a few simple tools? How much of human history relied on small, meticulous acts performed without recognition, yet critical to the stability of daily life? This question, unresolved, hovered in the shadows of the narrow alley as Godric stepped into the night, leaving behind the faint warmth of the forge and the precise mechanisms that would guard the city for days, weeks, and months to come. Morning arrives over the crowded streets of medieval London, bringing with it the bustle of markets, carts, and pedestrians. You find yourself again in Godric's workshop, where the quiet rhythm of metalwork contrasts with the noisy city outside. Today's focus is on the subtle, almost invisible details that determine whether a lock serves its purpose. The precise geometry of levers, the alignment of wards, and the patient layering of metal. These are the elements that distinguish a functional lock from a useless one, and they require not only skill but years of repetition. Godric begins with the selection of iron. Not all iron was equal. Softer bars could bend too easily, while harder varieties were difficult to shape without cracking. He tested each piece with careful taps of the hammer, listening for tonal differences that indicated density and integrity. Once chosen, the iron was heated in the forge to a precise temperature, red-hot but not glowing too brightly, allowing him to work without risk of splintering. The fire was constant yet subtle, fed steadily with charcoal to maintain the right heat, its glow illuminating shelves lined with partially finished keys and locks. The first task of the day was shaping the lock body. Using hammers, chisels, and files, Godric carved channels for internal levers and wards. Each movement was deliberate, each strike calculated. One misalignment could prevent a key from turning, or allow a thief to bypass the mechanism entirely. He paused frequently, testing tolerances, sliding a file gently along a channel to ensure smooth movement. Repetition was key. The same motions performed hundreds of times shaped an intuition that could not be taught with words. Experience informed every stroke, every adjustment, and every minute decision. Apprentices worked quietly beside him, performing tasks that required precision but little judgment. One filed keys while another polished lock exteriors, smoothing rough edges to ensure durability. Though these duties were repetitive, they were fundamental. Each step contributed to the reliability of the final product, creating a chain of labor in which even the smallest oversight could have consequences. The workshop functioned like a small ecosystem. Every participant played a role. Every motion was part of a larger pattern, and every completed lock depended on this subtle coordination. Customers arrived intermittently, some bringing damaged locks from their homes or shops, others requesting new commissions. Wealthy merchants often demanded more complex mechanisms, with multiple levers and secret wards designed to frustrate intruders. Each new design required careful planning. Godric sketched ideas on scraps of parchment, measured dimensions meticulously, and consulted reference models he had kept for decades. Then he translated these abstract designs into iron and steel, a process requiring both patience and adaptability. The repetitive nature of shaping, filing, and assembling components remained, yet each lock carried subtle variations that reflected the specific needs of its owner. Throughout the day, Godric also attended to repairs. Broken locks were disassembled, cleaned, and refitted. Springs and pins were replaced, levers adjusted, and doors tested repeatedly. Often, he had to improvise, using his knowledge of previous mechanisms to restore functionality with limited materials. The work demanded calm attention. Mistakes could render a lock unusable or compromise its security. Unlike crafting a new piece, repair required an understanding of both design and wear, adding a layer of complexity to the routine. As afternoon passed, Godric took time to test his creations. Keys were inserted, turned, and removed dozens of times. Locks were exposed to varying pressure, slightly jostled, and examined for resilience. Any flaw, however minor, was corrected immediately. The testing process was monotonous yet essential. It confirmed that each mechanism would withstand daily use, resist tampering, and fulfill its purpose. The quiet repetition of testing reinforced the workshop's unseen role in safeguarding the city. Beyond the immediate shop, The impact of Godric's work extended into broader society. Locks protected not only property but also trust. Merchants relied on secure storage to maintain inventory. Families depended on locks to safeguard possessions while they slept or went about errands. Civic institutions and religious establishments used keys to control access, ensuring that sensitive records, funds, or sacred items remained under authorized supervision. The reliability of these systems rested on the precision of Godric's work, performed day after day in quiet obscurity. Evening brought reflection. As the forge cooled and apprentices cleaned their tools, Godric examined the day's output, a set of locks, keys, and repairs, each tested and confirmed for function. Outside, London settled into the dim glow of torches and household candles. The city's rhythm depended on these small mechanisms. Doors closed securely, chests held valuables, and individuals could sleep with confidence that their property was protected. The quiet work of one man extended outward, shaping the security and order of countless lives. Yet, for all its reliability, the craft remained delicate. Iron could rust, springs lose tension, and keys could warp. The constant vigilance required in making, maintaining, and testing locks reminded Godric that security was never absolute. It was a careful balance of skill, observation, and routine maintenance. Even the most precise work required repetition, attention, and patience to ensure long-term effectiveness. As night fell over Raleigh, the workshop was quiet. Candles burned steadily, casting shadows on walls lined with iron and wood. The city outside, unaware of the precise adjustments made within this small room, moved safely in the trust of Godric's labor. The apprentice closed the shutters, the forge cooled to embers, and the locksmith finally set down his tools. Yet in the quiet glow, one thought persisted. How many other unseen acts, repeated patiently day after day, underpinned the safety and function of daily life in a medieval city? And how many of these labors would remain unrecognized, their impact felt but never recorded? The question lingered as Godric left the shop for the night, keys in hand, lantern glowing faintly at his side, a small emblem of order maintained through patient repetition, invisible vigilance, and the meticulous rhythm of craft. Night had fully settled over medieval London, wrapping the city in shadow and quiet. The cobbled streets glistened faintly with residual moisture from the late afternoon mist. In this dimness, the work of Godric, the locksmith, assumed its full significance. The locks and keys he had meticulously forged and tested throughout the day now performed their silent, indispensable duty, safeguarding property, protecting livelihoods, and preserving trust within the city. Though largely invisible, his craft was central to the functioning of daily life. Inside homes and shops, locks held fast, preventing opportunistic theft and allowing the city's inhabitants to continue their routines with a sense of security. A merchant could sleep knowing his coin chest remained intact. A craftsman could leave tools overnight without fear. Families could rest, confident that their doors barred unwanted entry. In each case, the stability derived from a combination of careful design, precise execution, and repeated testing, a trifecta of discipline that Godric had mastered over years of quiet labor. The locksmith's influence extended even further, into civic and religious life. Church treasuries, municipal records, and guild properties all relied on his expertise. Each lock was a small node in a network of order, a tangible assertion of control in a world often marked by uncertainty and danger. Though most people would never see the artisan or consider the effort behind each mechanism, their safety and convenience depended entirely on his skill. The invisible work of one man created a ripple of reliability across the city. Even with this importance, the craft remained delicate. Iron could corrode, wooden keys could warp, and springs could lose tension over time. The responsibility of maintaining security rested not only on the initial creation, but on ongoing vigilance. Godric understood this deeply. He often revisited previous commissions, checking for wear, reinforcing weak components, and offering guidance on proper use. In doing so, he ensured that the city's trust in him, and in the locks he produced, remained well placed. His labor was not glamorous or celebrated, yet its consequences were profound. The repetitive nature of his work shaped more than the physical city. It shaped character and discipline. Apprentices learned patience, precision, and attention to subtle detail, skills that extended beyond locksmithing into the conduct of daily life. The quiet rituals of hammering, filing, and testing forged habits that persisted long after the shop closed for the night. In this way, Godric's influence extended beyond locks themselves, into the development of a culture of reliability and measured effort. Outside, the city settled under the soft glow of torchlight and candle lamps. Noise diminished, shadows lengthened, and the rhythm of life slowed. In this quiet, the true impact of the locksmith became apparent. Every secure door, every protected chest, every confident household was a testament to the slow, careful work performed behind closed doors. Repetition, patience, and precision, elements often considered mundane, had produced a lasting stability that allowed human activity to continue with minimal disruption. In a world without these small acts, chaos would have been far more immediate, far more disruptive. As Godric extinguished the last lamp in his workshop and stepped into the night, the city's sounds were muted. He walked along narrow alleys, keys tucked securely at his side, aware that each mechanism he had touched was silently performing its duty. And yet, in the quiet of reflection, he could not help but wonder how many other unseen labors maintained the fragile balance of human life, preserving safety, order, and trust without recognition. How many moments of stability, of light, of protection, of routine, depended on the patient repetition of a single individual's craft. The night air was cold and still, yet the city's pulse continued, propelled in part by the quiet endurance of the locksmith's labor. It was a subtle, largely invisible force, yet profoundly shaping the lives around him. In the repetition of everyday work, in the careful shaping of iron, in the patient testing of keys and locks, Godric had forged more than mechanisms. He had forged reliability itself, and it was this invisible contribution, repeated day after day, that allowed the city and its people to carry on, secure in the knowledge that some measures of safety endured, quietly and steadfastly, without ever calling attention to themselves. Thus, as the flicker of lanterns danced in the streets and the city of London breathed in a measured, muted rhythm, one truth remained: ordinary labor, performed with care, patience, and precision, could sustain an entire community. And while the names of the locksmiths, candlemakers, and craftsmen were largely forgotten, their influence persisted, woven into the enduring fabric of human daily life. Step now into the streets of medieval York, where the roar of the Ouse River mingled with the hum of daily commerce. Here, water was both life and labor. Wells and cisterns existed, but much of the city's inhabitants depended on the tireless work of water carriers, ordinary people whose days were defined by buckets, leather pouches, and the constant flow of the river. Among them was a man named Anselm, whose role, though largely overlooked, was essential to the survival of his neighbors and the rhythm of city life. Anselm's work began long before sunrise. The river was calm in the early hours, mist rising from its surface as the city slumbered. He would fill leather pouches or wooden buckets, balancing them carefully on a yoke across his shoulders. Each container required exacting attention. Too heavy, and the water would spill, soaking the carrier and potentially damaging roads and goods. Too light, and the effort of repeated trips would be wasted. The task demanded both physical endurance and careful planning. The streets of York presented their own challenges. Cobblestones were uneven, often slippery with mud or residual rain. Narrow alleys and crowded markets required deft navigation. Anselm had to adjust his pace constantly, ensuring that he maintained balance while negotiating pedestrians, carts, and livestock. Even a minor misstep could spill precious water, leaving households without the basic resource they depended on. In this sense, the labor was both mundane and critical. It was the kind of work that quietly underpinned the functioning of an entire urban population. Water was required for nearly every aspect of daily life. Homes used it for cooking, washing, and personal hygiene. Bakeries needed consistent access to clean water for dough. Workshops relied on it for cleaning tools or softening hides. Religious institutions depended on water for ritual washing, ablutions, and preparation of sacred spaces. Anselm's deliveries, though repetitive, ensured that these activities could continue uninterrupted. Without him, the city's intricate network of domestic and civic life would falter. The work itself was slow and methodical. Each stop required careful attention, a precise pour into a household system, inspection of containers to ensure cleanliness, and the occasional exchange of words with residents. Many of them greeted Anselm with quiet acknowledgement, aware of the reliability of his service. Though the work lacked grandeur, it provided a subtle sense of status. He was known for dependability, for never spilling a drop, for maintaining the rhythm of water distribution that allowed life to flow smoothly through the city's streets. Apprentices occasionally assisted, carrying smaller buckets or helping with the heaviest loads. In doing so, they learned lessons that went beyond physical labor: timing, observation, balance, and the delicate art of anticipating obstacles. Each repetition of filling, carrying, and delivering reinforced a rhythm, a silent knowledge that flowed as steadily as the water itself. The work required patience, consistency, and endurance, qualities that defined Anselm's existence as much as any skill with tools or trade. Even as he traveled through bustling markets or quiet residential streets, Anselm became aware of the invisible threads his labor supported. Bakers could prepare bread, laundresses could cleanse garments, households could maintain cleanliness and health. The flow of water was not merely a convenience but a foundation for survival. Without steady, reliable delivery, the city's inhabitants would face both inconvenience and real danger. Repetition, quiet vigilance, and careful attention to detail sustained not only life but also the social order of York. As the morning sun climbed, Anselm paused briefly at the river, observing its movement. The flow was constant, yet each day's work demanded fresh energy. Even the most reliable river did not carry itself into homes. The labor of human hands, repeated day after day, brought water to the people and ensured continuity in routines that otherwise would collapse into disorder. In this quiet labor lay both humility and necessity, a reminder that the mundane could be essential and the ordinary could sustain life itself. By mid-afternoon, the day's deliveries were well underway. Containers were refilled, alleys navigated, and households served. The repetition of lifting, balancing, and pouring might seem dull to an outsider, yet in these patterns of motion, rhythm and reliability were established. Anselm's labor, though largely unnoticed beyond the grateful acknowledgement of recipients, connected the river to the people, transforming a natural resource into an essential part of daily urban life. And as he rested briefly by a shaded embankment, Anselm considered the invisible consequences of his work. How many routines, meals, and tasks depended entirely on the flow of water he delivered. How many moments of life relied on patience, repetition, and quiet endurance. Though he could not see the full extent of his influence, he understood that his labor was vital, forming a silent backbone for the rhythm of the city. Yet a question lingered, unresolved, in the back of his mind. If a single day's misstep, spillage, miscalculation, or accident could disrupt countless routines, how delicate was the invisible network he maintained, and how much of human survival rested on such seemingly mundane but crucial acts of labor. The sun rose higher over York, casting long shadows across the narrow streets, and the city began to stir with its full energy. Merchants called out from their stalls, carts rattled along the cobblestones, and children played near the edges of markets. Amid this bustle, Anselm resumed his work, carrying water along routes that were as familiar to him as the lines of his own hands. The day was long, repetitive, and physically demanding, yet it was in this rhythm that the true value of his labor became clear. Each trip to the river required preparation. Leather pouches had to be inspected for leaks, buckets balanced, and yokes adjusted to avoid chafing. Even the smallest oversight could lead to spillage or injury, which would compromise the delivery schedule. Anselm had learned through years of repetition to sense the subtle differences in weight distribution, the resistance of a filled bucket, and the way each step interacted with uneven streets. Over time, these motions became second nature, a silent knowledge embedded in muscle memory, a skill honed by routine and endurance. The streets themselves posed constant challenges. Market traffic required careful navigation to avoid collisions with carts, animals, or other pedestrians. Mud and puddles demanded attention, as slipping could spill water and waste hours of effort. Narrow alleys required turning and lifting with precision, particularly when balancing large wooden buckets or multiple leather pouches. Every delivery, no matter how routine, was a small exercise in planning, balance, and foresight. This was a world where repetition was not monotony, it was survival. Along his route, Anselm interacted with the city's residents. Many were accustomed to his presence, greeting him with brief nods or quiet thanks. In wealthier homes, he was entrusted with heavier or more specialized containers, while smaller households relied on simpler vessels. In every case, the precision of his work determined whether daily life could proceed uninterrupted. Cooking, cleaning, washing, and ritual ablutions all depended on a steady supply of water. The repetitive act of lifting, pouring, and returning to the river was therefore far more than physical labor. It was a critical service sustaining life itself. Apprentices, or assistants, when present, learned the nuances of the work through observation and imitation. They discovered that timing mattered as much as strength. A pause to inspect a worn leather pouch, or a brief adjustment of a yoke, could prevent accidents that might disrupt the delivery schedule. Subtle lessons about consistency, awareness, and endurance were absorbed through repeated exposure. These young helpers also came to understand that labor, performed with diligence, could create stability far beyond the visible moment of effort. Midday brought a brief respite. Anselm would rest by the river, observing its constant flow. The current never stopped. Yet it required human intervention to transform the natural resource into practical utility. Watching the water move reminded him of the larger network he supported. Each household, bakery and workshop depended on his steady contributions. The repetition of lifting and pouring was more than habit. It was the daily maintenance of life's rhythm, a quiet but indispensable act. The afternoon continued in similar patterns. Trips to refill containers, careful navigation of the streets, measured deliveries, and precise handling of vessels. Mistakes were costly. A spilled bucket could leave a family without water for hours. An overloaded yoke could injure the carrier or damage containers. Yet, through patient repetition, Anselm ensured that such failures remained rare. His expertise, honed over years, created reliability in a world where disruption was easy and stability required effort. As evening approached, the workload began to ease, but the day's influence extended beyond immediate deliveries. Water left in cisterns and household containers enabled cooking, cleaning, and evening routines. Bakers prepared loaves that would be sold the following day. Families washed and repaired clothing, and workshops continued labor with sufficient supply. The city's survival depended on this unseen continuity, sustained by the simple, repetitive work of carrying water. It was a quiet web of labor, invisible to most, yet essential to all. In the fading light, Anselm paused again along the riverbank, reflecting on the network of dependence he maintained. Each repetition, each careful step, each steady pour reinforced a fragile but essential balance. The city relied on his labor in ways few considered, yet without it, the rhythm of life would falter. The mundane task of water delivery, repeated hundreds of times, had become the backbone of domestic, commercial, and civic continuity. And as shadows lengthened, a question lingered. How many other systems of survival relied on such uncelebrated repetitive labor? How much of human continuity depended on the quiet diligence of those whose names would never be recorded, yet whose hands shaped the very conditions of daily life? These questions unresolved accompanied Anselm as he prepared for one final round of deliveries before nightfall, aware that each movement, repeated over decades, upheld the essential rhythm of the city. Night had descended over York, bringing a quiet stillness to streets that had been lively just hours before. Torches flickered in doorways, and the gentle murmur of the Ouse River filled the air with a steady, calming rhythm. Amid this calm, the labor of Anselm, the city's water carrier, revealed its profound importance. Though largely invisible to the city's inhabitants, his repetitive, patient work ensured the continuity of daily life. Without it, even ordinary routines, cooking, washing, craft work, or prayer, could falter. Evening rounds were methodical. Anselm carried smaller loads for the last households, ensuring cisterns and containers were full before nightfall. Each step required careful attention. Cobblestones could be slippery, and the risk of spills persisted until the final drop was delivered. The repetitive nature of his labor, honed over years, allowed him to perform this work with both efficiency and precision. It was a rhythm that had become second nature, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next. The significance of his work extended beyond individual homes. Bakers relied on water for dough, laundresses for washing, and workshops for cleaning tools and softening hides. Even religious rituals depended on a steady supply for ablutions or preparations of sacred spaces. Every drop carried, every careful step repeated, supported a network of life, commerce, and faith. Anselm's labor, though ordinary in action, was extraordinary in consequence. Apprentices who assisted him had absorbed lessons that went far beyond physical endurance. They learned patience, timing, observation, and problem-solving. Each repetition reinforced a deep understanding of responsibility. Small errors could cascade, affecting not just one household, but potentially dozens. In this way, the mundane became essential, teaching not only skill, but an awareness of one's impact on the broader community. By the time his final deliveries were completed, the city was fully dark, save for the glow of household candles and torchlight. Families gathered around their evening meals, workshops cleaned up, and streets emptied as people retreated indoors. The water Anselm had carried sustained all these activities, quietly enabling the routines that kept the city alive. His work was largely unnoticed, yet without it, the rhythms of daily life would falter. Returning to the riverbank to inspect his equipment one last time, Anselm reflected on the invisible network his labor supported. Each repetition of lifting, balancing, and pouring had ripple effects far beyond the immediate moment. The city's survival, its commerce, and even its social cohesion depended on such steady, patient work. In an era before plumbing, piped water, or municipal infrastructure, life rested on the hands of individuals like him. As he prepared to rest, a thought lingered: human society depends not only on monumental events, heroic figures, or wars, but also on countless small acts repeated daily and often without recognition. The endurance of routine labor, mundane, patient, precise, shapes, lives quietly but irrevocably. The flow of water, maintained by steady hands and careful planning, exemplified this truth. Life persisted, day after day, on the quiet reliability of ordinary people. And so, as the city slept, and the river continued its eternal course, Anselm's labor persisted in its effects. Invisible yet indispensable, repetitive yet profound, it maintained not only the water that sustained life, but the trust, continuity, and rhythm of an entire community. In the end, it was a reminder that survival, order, and progress often depend on the invisible, uncelebrated labor of those whose names are rarely recorded, but whose work endures far beyond their presence.